Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Alright, before we begin, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we'll be exploring a tragic case from Mission, British Columbia, the murder of 18-year-old Rachel Pernosky. This is a story that shocked a small Canadian community in 2013, a case that would remain unsolved for 3 long years before a shocking revelation tore apart a family forever. Please, if you're new here, welcome to our channel where we explore true crime stories in a calm, respectful manner. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this is a real story about real people. Rachel was a young mother, daughter, sister, and friend whose life was cut tragically short. We tell her story tonight with respect for her memory and for all those who loved her. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let me take you back to March 2013, to the quiet city of Mission, nestled in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia, where spring was just beginning to touch the mountain air, and where a young woman was about to disappear without a trace. Rachel Marie Pernosky was just 18 years old in March of 2013, but she had already experienced more responsibility than many people twice her age. She was the devoted mother of a baby boy, and despite her youth, those who knew her described her as mature beyond her years, someone who had embraced motherhood with determination and love. Rachel lived on Kite Street in Mission, a small city of about 38,000 people located about an hour's drive east of Vancouver. Mission sits beautifully in the Fraser Valley, surrounded by mountains and forests, the kind of place where people know their neighbors and children play safely in tree-lined streets. It's the kind of community where tragedy feels impossible, where families put down roots and expect to watch their children grow up in peace. But Rachel's path to motherhood hadn't been conventional. As a teenager, she had made the difficult but courageous decision to keep her baby and raise him as a single mother. Those close to her said she took this responsibility seriously, that she was focused on providing the best life possible for her son. She was described by friends as silly and funny, someone who could light up a room with her smile, but also as someone who understood the gravity of caring for another human being. The house on Kite Street where Rachel lived with her young son was modest but comfortable. It was her sanctuary, the place where she was building her new life as a mother. The walls held the sounds of a baby's laughter, the soft music Rachel loved to play, and the quiet moments of a young woman learning to navigate the complexities of raising a child largely on her own. Rachel had plans. She had dreams that extended beyond her current circumstances. Like many young mothers, she was working to balance the immediate needs of caring for her child with her own aspirations for the future. She maintained friendships, made plans to go shopping with friends, and tried to hold on to pieces of the carefree teenager she had been while embracing the woman and mother she was becoming. Her family structure was complex, as many modern families are. Rachel had siblings, including half-siblings, spread across different households. Family relationships can be complicated under the best of circumstances, and Rachel's family had its share of challenges. There were tensions, periods of estrangement, relationships that had grown strained over time and distance. But on March 16, 2013, none of these complexities seemed to matter. Rachel was simply a young mother planning to meet a friend for a day of shopping, the kind of ordinary Saturday plan that thousands of people make every week, the kind of simple pleasure that makes life worth living. Saturday, March 16, 2013, started like any other day on Kite Street. The morning was crisp with the promise of spring, and Rachel Pernosky was looking forward to her plans. She had arranged to meet a friend for a shopping trip, nothing elaborate, just the kind of casual outing that young women cherish, a chance to browse stores, try on clothes, maybe grab coffee, and catch up on each other's lives. But as the hours passed that Saturday, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Rachel's friend waited at their agreed meeting place, checking her phone repeatedly, wondering if there had been a miscommunication about the time or location. At first, it was just mild annoyance. We've all been there, waiting for someone who's running late. But as minutes turned into an hour, and then longer, concern began to creep in. Rachel wasn't the type to simply not show up. She was reliable, especially when it came to making plans with friends. If something had come up with her baby, if there had been an emergency, she would have called. She would have sent a message. The silence was completely out of character. Growing increasingly worried, Rachel's friend decided to reach out to Rachel's family. She contacted Rachel's sister, Brittany, explaining that Rachel had failed to show up for their shopping date and wasn't answering her phone. Brittany felt that immediate surge of concern that family members know all too well, that cold feeling in the pit of your stomach when something doesn't feel right. Brittany decided to go to Rachel's house on Kite Street to check on her sister and nephew. The drive through Mission's quiet streets probably felt eternal, filled with Brittany's mind racing through possibilities. Maybe Rachel had overslept. Maybe the baby was sick. Maybe her phone had died. There had to be a simple explanation. But when Brittany arrived at the house on Kite Street, what she found only deepened the mystery. The house appeared normal from the outside. There were no signs of disturbance, no indication that anything was amiss. But when Brittany entered the home, she discovered details that would haunt investigators for years to come. Rachel was nowhere to be found, but her baby was there. The music was still playing in the house, creating an eerie soundtrack to the unfolding mystery. Rachel's phone, her lifeline to the outside world, the device she would have used to call her friend or cancel their plans, was sitting inside the house, abandoned. For a young mother in 2013, leaving the house without her phone was almost unthinkable. This was the era when smartphones were becoming essential, when people felt naked without their devices. For Rachel, who had a young child and maintained contact with friends and family through her phone, leaving it behind would have been like leaving without her wallet or keys. But perhaps most telling of all, there were no signs of forced entry. The house hadn't been broken into. There was no evidence of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no indication that Rachel had been taken against her will from her own home. The scene suggested that Rachel had left voluntarily, but everything about the circumstances suggested that was impossible. The abandoned phone, the playing music, the missed appointment, the baby left behind, none of it made sense for a planned departure. Brittany called the police immediately. Even in those first moments, she knew this wasn't a case of Rachel simply changing her mind about shopping or getting distracted by something else. This was something much more serious. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived at the house on Kite Street that Saturday evening, they were faced with a puzzle that had no easy answers. The initial assessment confirmed what Brittany had already discovered: Rachel Pernosky had simply vanished. The officers who responded to the call found themselves walking through a home that felt frozen in time. The music continued to play, creating an almost surreal atmosphere as they documented the scene. Rachel's personal belongings were in place, her phone sitting where she had apparently left it, her purse and identification still in the house. In missing persons cases, the first 24 to 48 hours are critical. Statistics show that the longer someone remains missing, the less likely they are to be found alive. The police understood this urgency, and despite the fact that Rachel was an adult who had the right to leave if she chose to, the circumstances were troubling enough to warrant immediate action. The investigation began with the basics. When had Rachel last been seen? Who had spoken to her most recently? What were her habits, her routines, her state of mind in the days leading up to her disappearance? Family members and friends were interviewed, each conversation adding pieces to the puzzle of Rachel's final day. They painted a picture of a young woman who had been in good spirits, looking forward to her shopping trip, excited about the prospect of a day out with her friend. There had been no indication that she was planning to leave, no signs of depression or distress that might suggest she had harmed herself. The search expanded beyond the house on Kite Street. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to anyone who might have seen Rachel leaving her home or noticed anything unusual in the area. They checked local hospitals and shelters, contacted other family members, and began the methodical process of trying to trace Rachel's movements. Mission Search and Rescue was called in to assist with the operation. These volunteers, experienced in navigating the challenging terrain of the Fraser Valley, understood that time was of the essence. If Rachel was somewhere in the wilderness areas around Mission, if she had become lost or injured during a walk or hike, every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding her alive. The search team spread out across the community and into the surrounding forests. They walked trails, searched parks, looked along the Fraser River, and combed through areas where someone might seek shelter or where someone might dispose of evidence. The terrain around Mission is beautiful but unforgiving: dense forests, steep hills, rushing water, and countless places where someone could disappear without a trace. As word of Rachel's disappearance spread through the community, volunteers joined the search effort. This is what small communities do in times of crisis: they come together. Neighbors who barely knew Rachel found themselves walking through woods and fields, calling her name, hoping against hope to hear a response. The local media picked up the story, broadcasting Rachel's photograph and description across British Columbia. She was described as a white female, approximately 5 feet 3 inches tall, with brown hair and brown eyes. The last confirmed sighting placed her at her home on Kite Street, but beyond that, she had simply vanished into thin air. Social media played a role in spreading awareness about Rachel's disappearance. Facebook posts were shared hundreds of times, Twitter users retweeted her photograph, and online communities dedicated to missing persons cases picked up her story. In 2013, social media was still a relatively new tool in missing persons cases, but it was already proving its power to amplify urgent messages and coordinate search efforts. As the first day of searching concluded with no sign of Rachel, the investigation took on a more serious tone. What had initially been treated as a missing person case, with the hope that Rachel might return on her own or be found safe, was beginning to feel like something much darker. The fact that Rachel had left her baby behind was particularly troubling to investigators. While people might leave impulsively for various reasons, a devoted mother abandoning her infant child suggested either extreme duress or foul play. 3 days passed with no sign of Rachel Pernosky. 3 days of searching, of hoping, of family members keeping vigil by their phones waiting for news that never came. 3 days of a community holding its breath, praying for a miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely. Then, on March 19, 2013, the call came that everyone had been dreading but expecting. The location was in Chilliwack, a neighboring community about 20 kilometers southeast of Mission. The specific area was in the 43400 block of Old Orchard Road, a location that would become forever associated with tragedy in the minds of those who loved Rachel. A passerby had spotted something down a steep embankment, something that didn't belong in the natural landscape of the Fraser Valley. When police responded to investigate, they made the discovery that would transform Rachel's missing person case into a homicide investigation. Rachel's body had been found at the bottom of a steep, wooded embankment. The terrain was treacherous, so steep and challenging that search and rescue specialists had to be called in to safely retrieve her remains. This wasn't a location someone would stumble upon by accident, nor was it somewhere a person could easily end up without assistance. The discovery scene told its own story. Rachel hadn't died where she was found, her body had been placed there, hidden in terrain that would make discovery unlikely and recovery difficult. Someone had taken considerable effort to conceal what had happened to her, choosing a location that suggested familiarity with the area and a calculated attempt to hide evidence. The Integrated Homicide Investigation Team, HIT, immediately took over the case. IHIT is British Columbia's specialized unit for investigating homicides and suspicious deaths, a team of experienced detectives who understand the complexities of murder investigations. Their arrival at the scene marked the official acknowledgement of what everyone had begun to fear: Rachel Pernosky had been murdered. The news devastated her family and shocked the community. Rachel's sister Brittany, who had been the first to raise the alarm when Rachel went missing, now faced the unimaginable reality that her sister was never coming home. The young woman who had been planning a simple shopping trip just 3 days earlier was dead, her body discarded like refuse in a remote location. For Rachel's baby son, the discovery meant he had become an orphan before he was old enough to understand what that meant. He would grow up with only photographs and stories to connect him to the mother who had loved him, the young woman who had been building her life around caring for him. The community of Mission, which had mobilized to search for Rachel with hope in their hearts, now had to process the reality that one of their own had been murdered. The volunteers who had spent days walking through forests calling Rachel's name now knew they had been searching for a victim, not a missing person who might return home safely. The investigation that followed would be painstaking and complex. A-hit detectives began the methodical process of examining Rachel's relationships, her daily routines, her financial situation, and every aspect of her life that might provide clues about who had killed her and why. They conducted extensive interviews with family members, friends, acquaintances, and anyone who had had contact with Rachel in the days and weeks before her death. They examined her phone records, her social media accounts, her financial transactions, and any other digital footprints that might reveal her activities or state of mind. The autopsy would provide crucial information about how Rachel had died, but the location where her body was found had already told investigators important details about her killer. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a stranger abduction. The effort taken to hide Rachel's body suggested someone who knew her, someone who understood the need to conceal evidence, and someone familiar enough with the local geography to choose such a remote disposal site. As the investigation deepened, a troubling picture began to emerge, one that would ultimately lead to a revelation that would shock even experienced homicide detectives. In the weeks following the discovery of Rachel's body, the IHIT detectives working her case found themselves navigating the complex web of relationships that surrounded the young mother's life. Every homicide investigation is essentially a deep dive into a victim's world, their relationships, conflicts, fears, and secrets, and Rachel's case would prove to be particularly challenging. The statistics surrounding women who are murdered are sobering and consistent across jurisdictions. The vast majority are killed by someone they know. Current or former romantic partners, family members, friends, or acquaintances account for the overwhelming percentage of female homicide victims. Random stranger killings, while they capture media attention, are statistically rare. With this knowledge guiding their investigation, detectives began the careful process of examining everyone in Rachel's orbit. They looked at her relationships with friends, any romantic connections she might have had, neighbors, and family members. No one was above suspicion in the early stages of a homicide investigation. Rachel's role as a single mother added another layer of complexity to the investigation. Detectives had to consider whether her death might be connected to the father of her child, to disputes over custody or support, or to other issues related to her parenting situation. They examined her living arrangements, her financial situation, and any stressors she might have been experiencing as a young mother. The location where Rachel's body had been discovered continued to provide clues. Chilliwack, while a separate community from Mission, wasn't far away. Someone familiar with both areas would know about the remote location on Old Orchard Road. The killer hadn't just dumped Rachel's body anywhere, they had chosen a specific, isolated spot that would make discovery unlikely and evidence recovery difficult. This suggested local knowledge and planning. It indicated that Rachel's death wasn't the result of a spontaneous act of violence, but rather something that had been thought through, at least to the extent of considering how to hide the evidence afterward. The investigation also focused on the timeline of Rachel's disappearance. She had last been seen at her home on Kite Street on Saturday, March 16. Her body was discovered on Tuesday, March 19. Those 3 days represented a crucial window during which her killer had time to transport her body, conceal evidence, and establish alibis. Detectives worked to account for the movements and whereabouts of persons of interest during this critical period. They examined surveillance footage from businesses and traffic cameras, analyzed cell phone records to track movements, and interviewed anyone who might have seen suspicious activity during those 3 days. The forensic examination of Rachel's body and the crime scene where she was found would ultimately provide crucial evidence, but homicide investigations in 2013 were still limited by the technology available at the time. DNA analysis, while advanced, was more time-consuming and expensive than it would become in later years. Digital forensics, while useful, hadn't yet reached the sophistication that would characterize investigations just a few years later. As months passed without an arrest, the investigation began to feel the pressure that accompanies unsolved homicides. Rachel's family deserved answers, the community deserved to feel safe, and law enforcement needed to demonstrate that they could solve serious crimes and bring killers to justice. The case received periodic media attention, with journalists revisiting Rachel's story on anniversaries of her disappearance and death. Her family participated in these media appearances, hoping that renewed attention might generate new leads or encourage someone with information to come forward. But as 2013 turned into 2014, and then into 2015, Rachel's case began to take on the characteristics of a cold case. Active investigation continued, but without fresh leads or new evidence, detectives found themselves reviewing the same information repeatedly, hoping to spot something they had missed. Cold cases are among the most frustrating aspects of police work. Detectives know that someone, somewhere, has the information that could solve the case, but that person either doesn't realize the significance of what they know or is unwilling to come forward. Families live in limbo, unable to fully grieve because the person responsible for their loved one's death remains free. For Rachel's son, growing from a baby into a toddler during this period, the unsolved nature of his mother's murder meant living with questions that had no answers. His family could tell him that his mother had loved him, that she had been a good person who didn't deserve what happened to her, but they couldn't tell him who had taken her away or why. The investigation would eventually take a dramatic turn, but it would require patience, new techniques, and a breakthrough that would shock everyone involved in the case. By 2016, Rachel Pernosky's murder case had been unsolved for 3 years. The initial intensive investigation had generated hundreds of tips, dozens of interviews, and volumes of evidence, but no arrests. The case hadn't been forgotten. The hit detectives continued to work on it, reviewing evidence and following up on new leads, but it had settled into the grinding routine of a cold case investigation. Then something changed. The exact details of what prompted renewed focus on the case remain somewhat unclear, but investigators began concentrating their attention on Rachel's family members with new intensity. Sometimes in cold cases, fresh eyes or new techniques can illuminate evidence that was always there but not properly understood. The focus turned to Rachel's half-brother, Matthew Joseph Pernosky. Matthew was 31 years old in 2016, making him 13 years older than Rachel. He lived in Richmond, British Columbia, and had no criminal record, nothing in his background that would have immediately flagged him as a suspect in a violent crime. But family relationships can be complex and troubled in ways that aren't always visible to outsiders. As investigators dug deeper into the dynamics within Rachel's extended family, they began to uncover a history of estrangement and conflict that had escalated in the period before Rachel's death. The relationship between Rachel and Matthew had been strained for years. There were disputes, periods of no contact, and unresolved tensions that seemed to simmer beneath the surface of family gatherings and interactions. These kinds of family conflicts are unfortunately common, and most never escalate beyond harsh words and hurt feelings. But in some cases, family discord can turn deadly. The statistics on familial homicide are disturbing. Family members kill each other at rates that far exceed what most people would expect. Brothers kill sisters, parents kill children, and children kill parents with a frequency that speaks to the dark potential that exists within damaged family relationships. As the investigation into Matthew Pernosky intensified, detectives began to build a case that would ultimately rely on a controversial but legal investigative technique known as a Mr. Big operation. The Mr. Big technique is a uniquely Canadian approach to solving cold cases, developed by the RCMP in the 1990s. It involves creating an elaborate undercover scenario in which suspects are gradually drawn into what they believe is a criminal organization. Over weeks or months, undercover officers befriend the suspect, gain their trust, and eventually present them with opportunities to confess to unsolved crimes as a way of proving their worthiness to join the organization. The technique is controversial because it can involve deception, manipulation, and pressure that some argue amounts to entrapment. Critics worry that it can produce false confessions from vulnerable individuals who become convinced that admitting to crimes they didn't commit is their only way out of increasingly dangerous situations. But proponents of Mr. Big operations argue that the technique is effective at solving serious crimes that might otherwise remain unsolved forever. They point to successful prosecutions and argue that the elaborate nature of the operations, which typically last months and involve multiple officers and sophisticated planning, makes it unlikely that suspects would confess to crimes they didn't actually commit. In Matthew Pernosky's case, the Mr. Big operation began in early 2016. Undercover officers approached him and gradually drew him into what he believed was a criminal organization involved in various illegal activities. Over time, they gained his trust and presented him with increasingly serious scenarios that required proof of his criminal credentials. The operation culminated with Matthew being told that the organization needed to know about any serious crimes he might have committed in the past, crimes that could potentially be used against him or the organization if they came to light. It was in this context that Matthew Pernosky confessed to killing his half-sister Rachel. According to the confession obtained during the Mr. Big operation, Matthew admitted that he had suffocated Rachel during a dispute at her home on Kite Street. He described how he had killed her and then transported her body to the location in Chilliwack where it was eventually discovered. The confession provided investigators with the breakthrough they had been seeking for 3 years. But confessions obtained through Mr. Big operations must be corroborated with independent evidence to be admissible in court. The confession alone wasn't enough. Prosecutors needed to demonstrate that Matthew's account matched the physical evidence and circumstances of Rachel's death. On June 27, 2016, more than 3 years after Rachel Pernosky's body was discovered in that Chilliwack ravine, Matthew Joseph Pernosky was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and indignity to a human body. The arrest sent shockwaves through both families and the community that had been waiting for answers since 2013. For Rachel's family, the news brought a complex mix of emotions: relief that someone had been arrested, horror that the killer had been a family member, and renewed grief as the details of Rachel's final moments became public knowledge. The charge of second-degree murder indicated that prosecutors believed Matthew had killed Rachel intentionally but that the killing hadn't been planned in advance. First-degree murder requires premeditation, evidence that the killer planned the death ahead of time. Second-degree murder covers intentional killings that occur in the heat of the moment or as the result of disputes that escalate to violence. The additional charge of indignity to a human body related to Matthew's actions after Rachel's death, specifically, the way he had disposed of her body in the remote location where it was eventually found. This charge acknowledges that even after death, human remains deserve to be treated with respect, and that deliberately hiding or mistreating a body compounds the original crime of murder. Matthew appeared in court for his first hearing, where he was represented by legal counsel and the charges against him were formally read. The court appearance was brief and procedural, but it marked the beginning of a legal process that would ultimately determine whether the evidence gathered by investigators was sufficient to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The revelation that Rachel had been killed by her half-brother fundamentally changed how her family and friends understood her death. Family murders are particularly devastating because they violate the most basic assumptions about safety and trust. Rachel had been killed not by a stranger or even an acquaintance, but by someone who shared her blood, someone who had known her since childhood. The motive for the killing remained somewhat unclear from the public information available. Family disputes can escalate for many reasons: money, property, old grievances, personality conflicts, or mental health issues. The specific circumstances that led Matthew to kill Rachel would likely emerge during the trial, but the basic fact remained: a brother had murdered his sister. For Rachel's young son, the arrest meant learning that a family member, someone who should have been a protective figure in his life, had instead been the person who took his mother away from him. This knowledge would undoubtedly complicate his understanding of family relationships and his ability to trust as he grew older. The community of Mission, which had rallied around Rachel's family during the initial search and investigation, now had to process the reality that the killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. Matthew had lived freely for 3 years after the murder, going about his daily life while Rachel's family grieved and investigators worked to solve her case. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of many homicide cases, the period between the crime and the arrest during which killers continue their normal lives while families suffer. During those 3 years, Matthew attended family gatherings, interacted with Rachel's son, and participated in conversations about the ongoing investigation, all while knowing exactly what had happened to Rachel because he had been the one who killed her. The case also highlighted the effectiveness of the Mr. Big technique in solving cold cases. Without Matthew's confession to the undercover officers, it's possible that Rachel's murder might have remained unsolved indefinitely. The 3-year investigation had generated substantial evidence, but it apparently hadn't been sufficient to support charges until the confession provided the missing piece. However, the reliance on a Mr. Big operation also meant that the prosecution would face additional challenges at trial. Defense attorneys often challenge confessions obtained through these operations, arguing that they were coerced or that suspects were induced to make false admissions through pressure and manipulation. The legal proceedings would ultimately determine whether Matthew's confession was genuine and whether the evidence supported a conviction for Rachel's murder. The legal case against Matthew Pernosky moved through the British Columbia court system with the deliberate pace that characterizes serious criminal proceedings. Murder cases require extensive preparation by both prosecution and defense teams, with months or even years spent reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and developing legal strategies. For the prosecution, the case centered on Matthew's confession during the Mr. Big operation and the physical evidence that supported his account of Rachel's death. Prosecutors had to demonstrate not only that Matthew had confessed to the crime, but that his confession was reliable and consistent with the forensic evidence discovered during the investigation. The confession itself was detailed enough to provide specifics about how Rachel had died and what Matthew had done with her body afterward. According to his statements to the undercover officers, he had suffocated Rachel during a dispute at her home, then transported her body to the location in Chilliwack where it was eventually discovered. This account aligned with the physical evidence in several important ways. The location where Rachel's body was found was remote and difficult to access, suggesting someone familiar with the area had chosen it deliberately. The condition of her remains was consistent with the method of death described in the confession. The timeline Matthew provided matched the known facts about when Rachel disappeared and when her body was discovered. For the defense, the challenge was to either discredit the confession or argue that it had been obtained improperly through the Mr. Big operation. Defense attorneys in these cases often argue that the elaborate deception involved in such operations amounts to entrapment, or that suspects are pressured into making false confessions because they believe it's their only way to escape increasingly dangerous situations. Mr. Big operations have faced significant legal challenges in recent years, with some courts expressing concern about their potential to produce unreliable confessions. The technique requires suspects to be gradually drawn into what they believe is a criminal organization, often over periods of months, with undercover officers creating scenarios designed to elicit confessions. Critics argue that this process can be inherently coercive, particularly for individuals who may be vulnerable due to mental health issues, financial desperation, or social isolation. They worry that some suspects might confess to crimes they didn't commit because they've become convinced that doing so is necessary for their survival within the fictional criminal organization. However, proponents of the technique point out that successful Mr. Big operations typically produce confessions that include details about crimes that only the actual perpetrator would know. They argue that false confessions are unlikely because suspects wouldn't be able to provide accurate information about crime scenes, victim injuries, or other specific details that match the physical evidence. In Matthew's case, the key question would be whether his confession contained information that corroborated the known facts about Rachel's death in ways that would be impossible if he were innocent. If his account of events matched details that had never been made public, it would strongly suggest that his confession was genuine. The case also raised questions about family dynamics and the factors that had led to such a tragic outcome. While the specific motive for Rachel's murder might never be fully understood, the proceedings would likely reveal details about the relationship between the siblings and the circumstances that preceded her death. As the legal process continued, Rachel's family found themselves in the difficult position of supporting prosecution of a family member while also grieving the loss of their daughter and sister. Court proceedings in murder cases can be particularly traumatic for victims' families, as they're forced to relive the worst moments of their lives while facing the person responsible for their loved one's death. On May 3, 2018, nearly 5 years after Rachel's murder, Matthew Pernosky made a decision that would bring the case to an unexpected conclusion. Rather than proceed to trial, he entered a guilty plea to the charge of second-degree murder. The guilty plea meant that Matthew was acknowledging his responsibility for Rachel's death and accepting the legal consequences of his actions. It also meant that the details of the crime and the evidence against him would not be fully aired in a public trial, leaving some questions about motive and circumstances forever unanswered. On July 6, 2018, Matthew Joseph Pernosky was sentenced to life in prison for the second-degree murder of his half-sister Rachel. The sentence was automatic under Canadian law. Second-degree murder carries a mandatory life sentence with no possibility of parole for a minimum of 10 years. The judge had discretion in setting the parole eligibility period anywhere from 10 to 25 years, ultimately deciding that Matthew would be eligible to apply for parole after serving 14 years. The sentencing brought a measure of closure to a case that had haunted Rachel's family and the Mission community for more than 5 years. But closure in murder cases is always incomplete. No legal proceeding can bring back the victim or undo the trauma inflicted on those who loved them. For Rachel's son, who was now 6 years old, the conclusion of the legal case marked another chapter in a life shaped by tragedy. He had grown from a baby who would never remember his mother into a child old enough to understand that she was gone forever, killed by someone who should have protected her. Rachel's family released a statement expressing gratitude that justice had been served, but also acknowledging the complex emotions involved in seeing a family member held accountable for such a devastating crime. The statement read, in part, "We are very grateful and relieved that an arrest has been made in connection with Rachel's murder. Rachel was a mother, daughter, sister, and friend." The case highlighted several important issues about domestic violence, family murder, and the investigation of cold cases. Rachel's death was part of a disturbing pattern of violence against women that continues to plague communities across Canada and around the world. The statistics are sobering. Women are far more likely to be killed by intimate partners or family members than by strangers. The successful resolution of Rachel's case also demonstrated the value of persistence in cold case investigations. The 3 years between her murder and Matthew's arrest represented hundreds of hours of detective work, thousands of dollars in investigative resources, and the dedication of law enforcement professionals who refused to let her case be forgotten. The Mr. Big operation that ultimately led to Matthew's confession remains controversial, but in this case, it provided the breakthrough that allowed Rachel's family to finally know what had happened to her. The technique will continue to be debated in legal circles, but its effectiveness in solving serious crimes is difficult to dispute. As we conclude Rachel's story tonight, we remember her not as a victim, but as a young woman who loved her son, who had dreams and plans for the future, and who deserved to live a full life. She was 18 years old when she died, just beginning to discover who she might become as an adult, as a mother, and as a member of her community. Rachel's murder reminds us of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing the relationships we have with those we love. Her story is a tragedy, but it's also a testament to the dedication of law enforcement professionals who work tirelessly to seek justice for victims and their families. The city of Mission, which had rallied around Rachel's family during the darkest days of uncertainty, could finally begin to heal. The community had learned that evil could hide within families, that danger could come from unexpected sources, but they had also witnessed the power of collective support and the importance of never giving up hope for justice. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Rachel Pernosky, a young mother whose life was cut short but whose memory lives on in the son she loved, the family who grieved for her, and the community that refused to forget her story. Her case reminds us that every victim deserves justice, every family deserves answers, and every life has value that extends far beyond the circumstances of its ending. In the quiet darkness of your bedroom, in the safety of your home, take a moment to appreciate the ordinary moments that Rachel never got to experience, watching her son grow up, celebrating birthdays and holidays, making new memories with friends and family. These simple pleasures, which we often take for granted, were stolen from her on a March day in 2013 when trust was betrayed and family bonds were shattered forever. But Rachel's story doesn't end with tragedy. It continues in the memories of those who loved her, in the justice that was finally served, and in the reminder that even in our darkest moments, there are people working to bring light, investigators who won't give up, families who won't stop seeking answers, and communities that refuse to let victims be forgotten. As we reach the end of Rachel's story, it's important to reflect on the broader implications of cases like this one. Rachel Pernosky was one of dozens of women murdered in Canada in 2013, part of a tragic pattern that continues to this day across the world. Her case demonstrates both the challenges and the possibilities inherent in modern criminal investigations. The initial 3-year period during which her murder remained unsolved shows how difficult it can be to solve crimes, even when investigators are dedicated and resources are available. But the eventual breakthrough and conviction show that persistence can pay off, that new techniques can unlock old mysteries, and that families can eventually find the answers they desperately need. The Mr. Big operation that led to Matthew Pernosky's confession represents one of the more controversial tools in modern law enforcement. While critics worry about the potential for false confessions and the ethical implications of elaborate deception, supporters argue that such techniques are sometimes the only way to solve serious crimes that might otherwise remain forever unsolved. Rachel's case also highlights the particular tragedy of familial violence. When family members kill each other, they don't just destroy individual lives, they tear apart the fundamental bonds that hold families together. Rachel's son lost not only his mother but also had to grapple with the knowledge that a family member was responsible for that loss. The community response to Rachel's disappearance and murder demonstrated the best of human nature, neighbors and strangers coming together to search for a missing person, media outlets helping to spread awareness, and law enforcement professionals dedicating years of their lives to seeking justice for someone they had never met. In telling Rachel's story tonight, we honor her memory and acknowledge the ongoing work of those who investigate crimes, support victims' families, and work to prevent such tragedies from occurring in the future. Her life mattered, her death was a tragedy, and her story deserves to be remembered not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of the value of every human life and the importance of never giving up in the pursuit of justice. Please, I'm putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're traveling to the small town of Donaldsonville, Georgia, where a mother's disappearance would puzzle investigators for nearly 2 years before revealing a heartbreaking truth. Donaldsonville, a quiet town with fewer than 3,000 residents. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where news travels fast, and where a person's sudden absence is felt immediately by the entire community. Tonight, we'll explore the mysterious disappearance of 43-year-old Sharon Michelle Crawford, the desperate search that followed, and the tragic discovery that would finally bring answers to her family after 18 months of heartache and uncertainty. Sharon Michelle Crawford was 43 years old in the autumn of 2018. She was a mother of 4 children, a fact that would become crucial to understanding why her disappearance was so immediately alarming to those who knew her best. In small towns like Donaldsonville, people develop predictable routines. They shop at the same stores, frequent the same places, and maintain consistent patterns of behavior. Sharon was no different. She was known in her community, recognized by local business owners, and had established relationships with neighbors and acquaintances throughout the town. What made Sharon's case particularly concerning from the very beginning was her role as a mother. Mothers, especially devoted ones, don't simply vanish without explanation. They don't abandon their children without word. They don't break their established routines without cause. This understanding would drive much of the urgency in the early days of the investigation. Sharon was described as a black woman, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, with an average build. She had the kind of presence that people remembered, not because she was particularly outgoing or attention-seeking, but because she was consistent, reliable, and deeply connected to her family. The autumn of 2018 was particularly significant in Sharon's life, though we may never fully understand all the circumstances that led to the events that followed. What we do know is that Sharon was living in Donaldsonville, maintaining her routines, caring for her children, and participating in the quiet rhythms of small-town life. Her daily routine included the typical activities of a working mother in a small Georgia town. She would run errands, handle household responsibilities, maintain connections with family and friends, and navigate the various challenges that come with raising 4 children. These weren't extraordinary activities, they were the ordinary, precious moments that make up a life. But sometimes, it's the ordinary nature of someone's life that makes their sudden absence so shocking and inexplicable. The timeline of Sharon Crawford's disappearance is frustratingly imprecise, a fact that would complicate the investigation from the very beginning. Unlike cases where investigators can pinpoint an exact moment when someone was last seen, Sharon's case involves a window of time that spans several weeks. According to official reports, Sharon was last seen sometime between October and November of 2018. This imprecision isn't unusual in cases involving people whose daily routines don't include regular check-ins with employers, family members, or friends. In small towns, it's not uncommon for people to go days or even weeks without formal contact, especially if they're dealing with personal issues or family matters. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation would later indicate that while an exact date couldn't be established, the time frame was narrowed to late October through early November 2018. This suggests that Sharon's absence wasn't immediately noticed or reported, which tells us something about her circumstances during this period. Think about your own life for a moment. How long could you disappear before someone would notice? For most people, it's a matter of days. We have work obligations, family commitments, social connections that would make our absence obvious relatively quickly. The fact that Sharon could be missing for weeks before it was reported suggests she may have been going through a period of reduced social contact or personal difficulty. One of the most significant dates in this timeline is November 8, 2018. This is the date that appears in several official reports as Sharon's last known sighting. On this day, she was apparently seen in Donaldsonville, going about what appeared to be normal activities. She wasn't displaying signs of distress, she wasn't acting unusually, and there was nothing about her behavior that suggested she was in immediate danger. But November 8, 2018, would be the last time anyone would see Sharon Crawford alive. The days following November 8 passed quietly. Sharon's absence, initially, might not have seemed unusual to those around her. Perhaps she was taking time to herself, dealing with personal matters, or simply maintaining a lower profile than usual. In small towns, people sometimes step back from their usual social circles for various reasons: family issues, financial problems, relationship difficulties, or simply the need for privacy. As the days turned into weeks, however, the absence began to feel different. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages received no response. The usual signs of life, the small interactions and routine contacts that connect us to our communities, simply stopped. By November 27, 2018, the concern had grown serious enough that Sharon Crawford was officially reported missing to the Donaldsonville Police Department. This was nearly 3 weeks after her last confirmed sighting, a gap that would prove crucial to the investigation. When Sharon Crawford was reported missing on November 27, 2018, the Donaldsonville Police Department found themselves facing a challenging investigation. Chief Woodrow Blue Jr. and his team had to work backward from a missing person report that was filed nearly 3 weeks after the last confirmed sighting of their subject. In missing person cases, the first 48 hours are considered critical. During this time, investigators can interview witnesses whose memories are fresh, examine physical evidence that hasn't been disturbed, and track down leads while they're still warm. In Sharon's case, this crucial window had not only passed, it had been closed for weeks. The police department in Donelsonville is small, serving a community of fewer than 3,000 people. Chief Blue and his officers were experienced in handling the typical crimes and issues of a small southern town: property disputes, domestic disturbances, minor theft, and traffic violations. A missing person case, especially one involving a potential homicide, represented a significant challenge for the department's resources and expertise. The investigation began with the basics: establishing Sharon's last known activities, identifying potential witnesses, and creating a timeline of events. Officers canvassed the areas where Sharon was known to frequent, spoke with local business owners, and attempted to piece together her final days. One of the most significant challenges faced by investigators was the lack of concrete information about Sharon's state of mind and circumstances leading up to her disappearance. Had she been experiencing personal difficulties? Was she involved in any conflicts or disputes? Did she have any enemies or people who might wish her harm? These questions, crucial to any missing person investigation, were difficult to answer definitively. The police department issued public appeals for information, asking anyone who had seen Sharon or had information about her whereabouts to come forward. In small towns, these appeals often generate significant community involvement, as residents are generally eager to help locate missing neighbors. Local media outlets picked up the story, broadcasting Sharon's photograph and description throughout the region. The December 18, 2018 report on WCTV described Sharon as a 43-year-old black woman whose family was concerned for her safety and welfare. The report emphasized that she had been missing for several weeks and that police were actively investigating her disappearance. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that traditional missing person protocols weren't yielding results. Sharon hadn't been found at local hospitals, she hadn't been arrested in neighboring jurisdictions, and she hadn't made contact with family members or friends. All of these factors suggested that her disappearance was involuntary. By early 2019, the case had been ongoing for several months with no significant breaks. The initial optimism that Sharon might be found safe had given way to a more sobering reality: this was likely not a case of someone who had voluntarily disappeared. The investigation had evolved from a missing person case to a potential homicide investigation. The challenge for law enforcement was substantial. Without a crime scene, without witnesses to an actual crime, and without concrete evidence of foul play, investigators had to work with circumstantial evidence and the statistical reality that long-term missing person cases rarely end with the subject being found alive. As weeks turned into months, the absence of Sharon Crawford began to weigh heavily on the Donelsonville community. In small towns, missing person cases take on a particular intensity because everyone feels connected to the victim and their family. Sharon wasn't just a statistic or a case number, she was someone's mother, someone's neighbor, someone's friend. The Crawford family's anguish during this period was profound and public. Having 4 children meant that Sharon's disappearance affected not just her immediate family, but an entire network of young people who were dealing with the traumatic reality of their mother's absence. The psychological impact on children when a parent disappears cannot be overstated. They face not only the grief of loss but the terrible uncertainty of not knowing what happened. In February 2019, nearly 104 days after Sharon's last confirmed sighting, new evidence emerged that provided both hope and additional concern. Local news outlets reported that investigators had found evidence related to Sharon's case, though the specific nature of this evidence was not disclosed to the public. This development renewed attention on the case and led to increased community involvement in the search efforts. Chief Woodrow Blue Jr. organized community search efforts, recognizing that the department's limited resources could be supplemented by volunteer assistance from local residents. On one Saturday in February 2019, police coordinated a search of vacant properties and buildings throughout Donelsonville, with numerous community volunteers participating in the effort. These community searches serve multiple purposes in missing person investigations. Obviously, they expand the area that can be covered and increase the likelihood of finding physical evidence. But they also serve to keep the case in the public consciousness, demonstrate to the family that the community cares, and sometimes generate new leads as volunteers notice things that might have been overlooked. The search of vacant properties was particularly significant because it suggested that investigators were operating under the assumption that Sharon had met with foul play. Searches for living missing persons typically focus on areas where someone might be hiding, seeking shelter, or recovering from an injury. Searches of vacant buildings and remote properties often indicate that investigators are looking for evidence of a crime or, tragically, for human remains. During this period, Sharon's mother became a particularly visible advocate for continued investigation. Her pain was evident in every public appeal, every media interview, and every community meeting. She expressed frustration with the pace of the investigation while also acknowledging the challenges faced by local law enforcement. Her persistence in keeping Sharon's case in the public eye was crucial to maintaining momentum in the investigation. The emotional toll on the family was compounded by the uncertainty surrounding Sharon's fate. When someone dies in an accident or from natural causes, the family can begin the grieving process and work toward acceptance. When someone disappears without explanation, the family is trapped in a state of suspended grief, unable to move forward but unable to maintain hope without significant emotional cost. Community members organized vigils, prayer services, and fundraising efforts to support the family and to maintain awareness of Sharon's case. These events served both practical and emotional purposes, providing financial assistance to the family while also creating spaces for collective mourning and hope. As 2019 progressed, Sharon Crawford's case entered what investigators call the long tail of a missing person investigation. The initial burst of activity, media attention, and community involvement had given way to a more sustained but less intensive effort. This phase of an investigation is particularly difficult for families, as public interest wanes while their personal anguish continues. The Donaldsonville Police Department, recognizing the limitations of their resources, began working more closely with state and federal agencies. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation became more involved in the case, bringing additional expertise and resources to bear on the investigation. This collaboration is common in small-town cases that exceed the capabilities of local law enforcement. During this period, investigators continued to follow up on leads, re-interview witnesses, and examine physical evidence. Much of this work happens behind the scenes and doesn't generate media attention, but it's crucial to building a comprehensive understanding of the case. Investigators were likely working to establish Sharon's activities and associations in the months leading up to her disappearance, hoping to identify potential suspects or motives. The family's advocacy efforts continued throughout 2019. Sharon's mother and other family members worked to keep the case in the public eye through social media, community events, and regular contact with local media outlets. This sustained effort by the family is often crucial to keeping cold cases active and maintaining pressure on law enforcement to continue their investigation. One of the most challenging aspects of this period was the lack of concrete developments to report. Unlike active investigations where arrests are made or evidence is found, Sharon's case remained stubbornly mysterious. This lack of progress can be frustrating for everyone involved, the family, the investigators, and the community, but it's unfortunately common in complex missing person cases. As 2019 turned into 2020, Sharon's case approached the 2-year mark since her disappearance. Statistically, the likelihood of finding a missing person alive decreases dramatically after the first year, and investigators were likely operating under the assumption that Sharon had been the victim of foul play. This shift in perspective, while difficult for the family to accept, often leads to changes in investigative strategy and resource allocation. The case had also taken on symbolic significance within the community. Sharon's disappearance represented not just a personal tragedy but a reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist even in small, close-knit communities. Her case became a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining strong social connections and the need for communities to look out for their most vulnerable members. February 2020 brought a development that would forever change the nature of Sharon Crawford's case. Nearly 18 months after her disappearance, human remains were discovered in a field off Burlane Road and Robbie Forest Road, just north of the Donaldsonville city limits. The discovery of human remains in a missing person case is always a moment of profound significance. For the family, it represents the end of the terrible uncertainty that has defined their lives since the disappearance. For investigators, it transforms the case from a missing person investigation to a homicide investigation. For the community, it brings a somber resolution to a case that has haunted the collective consciousness. The location where Sharon's remains were found is significant for several reasons. The field was in a remote area, away from the main roads and residential areas of Donaldsonville. This suggests that whoever was responsible for Sharon's death had knowledge of the local area and specifically chose a location where the remains might not be discovered for an extended period. The remains were described as skeletal and dismembered, indicating that Sharon had been deceased for a significant period of time and that her death had involved extreme violence. This detail, while disturbing, provided investigators with important information about the nature of the crime and the potential perpetrator. The dismemberment of remains is a particularly heinous aspect of violent crime that suggests several possible motives or circumstances. It might indicate an attempt to conceal the identity of the victim, an effort to make the remains easier to transport or dispose of, or evidence of extreme rage or psychological disturbance on the part of the perpetrator. The discovery of the remains was likely the result of either an organized search effort or an accidental finding by someone in the area. Given the remote location and the fact that the remains had been undiscovered for nearly 2 years, it's possible that changing weather conditions, animal activity, or vegetation growth had made the site more visible or accessible. For investigators, the discovery of remains represented both a breakthrough and a new set of challenges. While they now had physical evidence of a homicide, they also faced the complex task of determining the cause of death, estimating the time of death, and identifying any physical evidence that might lead to the perpetrator. The forensic examination of skeletal remains is a specialized field that requires expertise in anthropology, pathology, and criminology. The condition of Sharon's remains, having been exposed to the elements for nearly 2 years, would have presented significant challenges to investigators attempting to determine the exact cause and manner of death. News of the discovery spread quickly through the Donaldsonville community. For many residents, it marked the end of hope that Sharon might still be found alive, while also providing a sense of closure to a case that had remained mysteriously unresolved for far too long. The discovery of human remains in February 2020 marked the beginning of a new phase in Sharon Crawford's case, the scientific process of identification and forensic analysis. While the location and circumstances of the discovery strongly suggested that these were Sharon's remains, definitive identification would require forensic confirmation. The identification process for skeletal remains can be complex and time-consuming, particularly when the remains have been exposed to environmental conditions for an extended period. Forensic anthropologists and pathologists must use a combination of techniques to establish identity, including dental records, DNA analysis, and comparison of physical characteristics. In Sharon's case, the identification process took several months. The remains were sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's crime lab, where specialists worked to confirm the identity of the deceased and to gather any additional evidence that might be relevant to the investigation. During this period, the family endured another agonizing wait. While the discovery of remains had provided some answers, the official confirmation of Sharon's identity was necessary before the family could begin the process of laying her to rest and seeking justice for her death. The identification was finally confirmed in September 2020, nearly 7 months after the discovery of the remains. This confirmation transformed the case from a mysterious disappearance to a confirmed homicide, changing both the nature of the investigation and the legal proceedings that would follow. For Sharon's family, the identification brought a mixture of grief and relief. The terrible uncertainty that had defined their lives since November 2018 was finally over, but it was replaced by the harsh reality of Sharon's violent death and the knowledge that someone had deliberately taken her life. The confirmation of Sharon's identity also meant that she could finally be laid to rest with dignity and that her family could begin the process of mourning her loss properly. The months of uncertainty had prevented the family from fully grieving, as they had been forced to maintain hope while also preparing for the worst possible outcome. With Sharon Crawford's death officially confirmed as a homicide, the investigation entered a new phase focused on identifying and prosecuting the person or persons responsible for her murder. However, this phase of the investigation has proven to be as challenging as the initial missing person case. The fact that Sharon's remains were discovered nearly 2 years after her death presented significant challenges for investigators. Physical evidence that might have been present at the time of her death had been lost to time and weather. Witnesses' memories had faded, and the crime scene had been significantly altered by environmental factors. Chief Woodrow Blue Jr. and the Donaldsonville Police Department, working in collaboration with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, continued to pursue leads and investigate potential suspects. However, the specific details of these investigative efforts have not been made public, which is typical in active homicide investigations. The dismemberment of Sharon's remains suggested that the perpetrator had some knowledge of anatomy or experience with butchering, though this type of evidence must be interpreted carefully. While such details can provide investigative leads, they can also be misleading if overinterpreted. The location where Sharon's remains were found also provided investigators with important information. The remote field suggested that the perpetrator was familiar with the local area and had deliberately chosen a location where the remains might not be discovered. This knowledge of local geography could indicate that the perpetrator was a local resident or someone with extensive knowledge of the Donaldsonville area. The length of time that elapsed between Sharon's disappearance and the discovery of her remains also suggested that the perpetrator had been successful in concealing the crime for an extended period. This level of concealment might indicate criminal sophistication or simply luck in choosing an effective disposal site. One of the most challenging aspects of the investigation has been the apparent lack of obvious suspects or motives. Sharon's case doesn't appear to fit the typical patterns of domestic violence, robbery, or random crime that characterize many homicides. This has made the investigation more complex and has required investigators to consider a wider range of potential motives and suspects. The family's continued advocacy has been crucial to maintaining momentum in the investigation. Sharon's mother has remained vocal about the need for justice and has worked to keep the case in the public eye. This family advocacy is often essential in cold cases, as it helps to maintain public interest and pressure on law enforcement to continue their efforts. As of the time of this recording, no arrests have been made in connection with Sharon Crawford's murder. The case remains open and active, with investigators continuing to follow leads and examine evidence. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation has indicated that they are committed to pursuing justice for Sharon and her family, regardless of how long it takes. The murder of Sharon Crawford has had a lasting impact on the Donaldsonville community that extends far beyond the immediate tragedy of her death. In small towns, violent crimes take on a particular significance because they shatter the sense of safety and security that residents often take for granted. Donaldsonville, like many small southern communities, has traditionally been a place where people feel safe walking alone at night, where children play outside without constant supervision, and where residents often leave their doors unlocked. The violent murder of a community member forces residents to confront the reality that such safety is not absolute and that evil can intrude even into the most peaceful communities. The manner of Sharon's death, the fact that she was murdered and dismembered, has been particularly disturbing to community members. This level of violence is shocking in any context, but in a small town where everyone knows everyone, it feels particularly personal and threatening. The unsolved nature of the case has added to the community's unease. Without an arrest or clear resolution, residents are left to wonder whether the perpetrator might still be among them. This uncertainty can create an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that affects the social fabric of the community. However, the case has also demonstrated the strength and resilience of the Donaldsonville community. The volunteer search efforts, the vigils and prayer services, and the continued support for Sharon's family have shown the positive aspects of small-town community life. When tragedy strikes, neighbors come together to support one another and to seek justice for the victims. The case has also highlighted the challenges faced by small-town law enforcement agencies when dealing with complex criminal cases. The collaboration between the Donaldsonville Police Department and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation has been essential to the investigation, demonstrating the importance of interagency cooperation in solving serious crimes. The story of Sharon Crawford's disappearance and murder is a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of community vigilance in protecting our most vulnerable members. Sharon was a mother, a neighbor, and a member of a small community who deserved to live her life in safety and dignity. Her case also illustrates the complex challenges faced by law enforcement when investigating missing person cases and homicides. The initial lack of concrete information about Sharon's disappearance, the delayed reporting of her missing status, and the discovery of her remains nearly 2 years later all contributed to the difficulty of the investigation. For Sharon's family, particularly her 4 children, the loss has been devastating and permanent. The uncertainty surrounding her disappearance was followed by the harsh reality of her violent death, and now they must live with the knowledge that her killer has not yet been brought to justice. The case remains open and active, with investigators continuing to pursue leads and examine evidence. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation has committed to seeking justice for Sharon and her family, and the community continues to support these efforts. Sharon Crawford's story is ultimately one of tragedy, but it is also a story of community resilience, family strength, and the persistent pursuit of justice. Her memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew her, and her case serves as a reminder that every victim of violent crime deserves to be remembered and to have their story told. As we conclude this story, we remember Sharon Crawford not just as a victim of a terrible crime, but as a person who lived, loved, and was loved in return. Her story is a reminder that behind every true crime case is a real person whose life had meaning and value. The investigation into Sharon's murder continues, and anyone with information about her case is encouraged to contact the Georgia Bureau of Investigation or the Donaldsonville Police Department. Justice for Sharon and her family remains possible, and the community's continued support for the investigation is essential to achieving that goal. Please, if you're enjoying this stories, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we're traveling to the quiet town of Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, where in March 2013, a story unfolded that would shake this close-knit community to its core. This is the story of Sydney Nicole Randall, a bright 14-year-old girl whose disappearance would launch one of the largest searches in Lawrence County history. Sydney was described by those who knew her as a beautiful, vivacious teenager with dreams and aspirations like any other 14-year-old. She was involved in beauty pageants, had close friendships, and was navigating the typical challenges of adolescence. But beneath the surface of what appeared to be a normal family life, darker currents were flowing, currents that would ultimately lead to tragedy. Our story begins on the night of March 9, 2013, in Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, a small town of about 3,000 people nestled in the northeastern part of the state. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where children play outside until the streetlights come on, and where the most exciting event might be a high school football game on Friday night. It was in this seemingly safe environment that Sydney Randall would vanish without a trace, setting off a chain of events that would reveal disturbing truths about trust, family, and the monsters that sometimes hide in plain sight. To understand the tragedy that befell Sydney Randall, we must first understand who she was as a person. Sydney Nicole Randall was born in 1998, growing up in the heart of Arkansas. She was the daughter of Victor Randall, and as is often the case in modern families, her parents' relationship didn't last. When Sydney was younger, her mother Denise married John Cornell, bringing a stepfather into Sydney's life. From the outside, Sydney appeared to be thriving. She was involved in beauty pageants, something that brought her joy and gave her confidence. Those who knew her described her as outgoing and friendly, the kind of teenager who lit up a room when she walked in. She had the typical interests of a 14-year-old girl in 2013, social media, friends, music, and dreams about her future. But Sydney's life wasn't as picture-perfect as it might have seemed to casual observers. Her biological father, Victor Randall, lived separately from Sydney, Denise, and John Cornell. This meant that Sydney's day-to-day life was spent primarily with her mother and stepfather. The dynamics of blended families can be complex under the best of circumstances, but in Sydney's case, there were underlying tensions that those closest to her were beginning to notice. Sydney's friends would later tell investigators that she had begun expressing concerns about her home life. She mentioned feeling uncomfortable around her stepfather, John Cornell. These weren't casual complaints about typical step-parent-stepchild friction, the kind of "you're not my real dad" arguments that are common in blended families. Instead, Sydney's concerns were more serious, more troubling. She confided in friends that she felt afraid of John Cornell, though the full extent of her fears wouldn't become clear until much later. Victor Randall, Sydney's biological father, had also begun to notice changes in his daughter's behavior during their visits. She seemed more withdrawn, more anxious. There were subtle signs that something wasn't right, the way she flinched at certain topics, the haunted look that would sometimes cross her face, the way she seemed reluctant to return home after spending time with her father. These concerns led Victor to begin suspecting that something inappropriate might be happening in Sydney's home environment. His suspicions centered on John Cornell, the man who had married Sydney's mother and become a central figure in her daily life. Victor's protective instincts as a father were telling him that his daughter was in danger, but proving such suspicions and taking action to protect Sydney would prove to be more complicated than he could have imagined. Meanwhile, Denise Cornell, Sydney's mother, appeared to be unaware of any problems in her household. She would later tell investigators that she believed Sydney and John had what she considered a normal stepfather-stepdaughter relationship. This disconnect between how Denise perceived her family dynamics and the reality that Sydney was experiencing would become a crucial element in understanding how this tragedy was allowed to unfold. The stage was being set for a perfect storm. Sydney was a vulnerable teenager trapped in a situation where she felt she couldn't speak freely about what was happening to her. Her biological father suspected abuse but was limited in his ability to intervene. Her mother seemed oblivious to the danger her daughter was facing. And John Cornell, the man at the center of these concerns, was about to prove that the worst fears about him were entirely justified. March 9, 2013, began like any other Saturday in the Randall Cornell household. Sydney spent time with friends, engaged in typical teenage activities, and seemed to be in relatively good spirits. There was nothing about this particular day that would have suggested to anyone that it would be the last day Sydney Nicole Randall would be seen alive. As evening approached, Sydney returned home to the house she shared with her mother Denise and stepfather John Cornell. The family settled in for what should have been a quiet Saturday night. Denise went to bed, expecting to wake up Sunday morning to find her daughter safe in her own room, as she had countless times before. But when Denise woke up on Sunday morning, March 10, she discovered that both Sydney and John Cornell were missing from the house. This immediately struck her as odd. While it might not be unusual for a teenager to slip out without permission, it was strange that John would also be gone, and even stranger that they would be gone together. Denise's confusion turned to concern as the morning progressed without any sign of either Sydney or John. She tried calling John's phone, but got no answer. She checked with Sydney's friends to see if anyone had heard from her, but no one had. The pit of worry in her stomach grew larger with each passing hour. Then, sometime during the late morning or early afternoon of March 10, John Cornell returned to the house. But he returned alone. When Denise asked him where Sydney was, his explanation was vague and unsatisfying. He claimed that he didn't know where she was, and that he was as concerned about her absence as Denise was. John's behavior during this conversation would later be scrutinized by investigators. Rather than seeming genuinely worried about Sydney's disappearance, he appeared nervous and evasive. When Denise pressed him for details about where he had been and what had happened, his answers were inconsistent and didn't make sense. Despite her growing suspicions about John's involvement in Sydney's disappearance, Denise was still operating under the assumption that there might be an innocent explanation for what was happening. John told her that he would file a police report about Sydney being missing, which seemed like the appropriate response from a concerned stepfather. However, what Denise didn't know was that during the hours when both Sydney and John were missing from the house, something terrible had occurred. The last hours of Sydney's life were spent in the company of the very person who should have been protecting her. Instead of being her guardian, John Cornell had become her greatest threat. The timeline of exactly what happened during those missing hours would later be pieced together by investigators through physical evidence and forensic analysis. What they would discover was a horrific sequence of events that began with Sydney being vulnerable and alone with her stepfather, and ended with her being murdered by the man her mother had trusted to help raise her. While Denise waited anxiously at home for news of her daughter, and while John Cornell maintained his facade of concern, Sydney's body was lying somewhere in the Arkansas landscape, a victim of the worst kind of betrayal. The man who had promised to be a father figure to her had instead become her killer. The community of Walnut Ridge was about to be thrust into one of the most intensive missing person searches in the area's history. Volunteers would search for days, hoping against hope that Sydney would be found alive. Law enforcement would dedicate enormous resources to the case. The media would pick up the story, spreading Sydney's photo across the region and beyond. But even as all of these efforts were being mobilized to find Sydney, the person who knew exactly where she was, and exactly what had happened to her, was sitting in the same house where Sydney should have been safe, pretending to be as mystified and worried as everyone else. By the evening of March 10, 2013, it was clear that Sydney Randall wasn't coming home on her own. What had started as confusion and concern in the Cornell household was rapidly escalating into a full-blown missing person case. The Walnut Ridge Police Department, along with the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office, began treating Sydney's disappearance as a serious emergency. The initial hours of any missing person investigation are crucial, particularly when the missing person is a minor. Law enforcement officers immediately began gathering information about Sydney's last known whereabouts, her typical routines, her friends, and anyone who might have had contact with her. They interviewed Denise Cornell extensively, trying to establish a timeline of Sydney's activities leading up to her disappearance. John Cornell was also interviewed during these early stages of the investigation. As Sydney's stepfather and the last person known to have seen her, he was a crucial witness. However, investigators quickly began to notice inconsistencies in his statements. His account of the events surrounding Sydney's disappearance didn't align with other evidence they were gathering, and his behavior during questioning raised red flags. Despite these early suspicions about John Cornell, the investigation proceeded on multiple fronts. Law enforcement couldn't afford to focus exclusively on one suspect while Sydney might still be alive and in need of rescue. They had to explore every possible scenario, from Sydney running away on her own to her being abducted by a stranger. The search for Sydney quickly became a community-wide effort. Word spread throughout Walnut Ridge and the surrounding areas that a local teenager was missing. Volunteers began organizing search parties to comb through wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and any other locations where Sydney might be hiding or being held. The Arkansas State Police became involved in the case, bringing additional resources and expertise to the investigation. They coordinated with local law enforcement agencies to ensure that all available resources were being utilized effectively. The FBI was also contacted, as they often are in cases involving missing children, though their direct involvement in the early stages was limited. As news of Sydney's disappearance spread beyond Walnut Ridge, media outlets began covering the story. Local television stations and newspapers featured Sydney's photo and details about her disappearance, hoping to generate tips from the public. Social media played a role as well, with Sydney's friends and family members sharing her photo and information about the case across various platforms. The search efforts were extensive and systematic. Volunteers and law enforcement officers searched wooded areas around Walnut Ridge, abandoned buildings, construction sites, and any other locations where a missing teenager might be found. They used dogs trained in search and rescue operations, and they coordinated their efforts to ensure that no area was searched multiple times while other areas were overlooked. However, as the hours turned into days, the hope of finding Sydney alive began to fade. The longer she remained missing, the more likely it became that something terrible had happened to her. This reality was not lost on the investigators working the case, who began shifting their focus from a rescue operation to a criminal investigation. During this time, John Cornell's behavior continued to raise suspicions. While Sydney's mother Denise was visibly distraught and desperate for any news about her daughter, John seemed less emotionally invested in the search efforts. He participated in some of the organized searches, but investigators noted that his behavior seemed more performative than genuine. The investigation into Sydney's disappearance was about to take a dramatic turn that would change everything about how the case was perceived and investigated. The man who was supposed to be helping find Sydney was about to reveal, through his actions, that he knew far more about her fate than he had been letting on. March 11, 2013, dawned with Sydney Randall still missing and the search efforts continuing across Lawrence County. It had been 2 full days since anyone had seen the 14-year-old girl, and the mood in Walnut Ridge was becoming increasingly somber. What had started as an urgent search and rescue operation was beginning to feel more like a recovery mission. But the morning of March 11 would bring a shocking development that would change the entire nature of the investigation. At some point during that day, John Cornell was found dead from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The man who had been a key witness in Sydney's disappearance, and who was increasingly viewed as a suspect in her case, had taken his own life. The discovery of John Cornell's body sent shockwaves through the investigation and the community. For Denise Cornell, it was a double tragedy: her daughter was missing and presumed to be in danger, and now her husband was dead. The emotional impact of these events was devastating for a family that had been hoping for Sydney's safe return just hours earlier. From an investigative standpoint, John Cornell's suicide was significant for several reasons. First, it strongly suggested that he had been involved in Sydney's disappearance. Innocent people don't typically kill themselves while their stepdaughters are missing. Second, it meant that investigators would no longer be able to question him about what had happened to Sydney. If he had information about her whereabouts or her fate, that information had died with him. The timing of John Cornell's suicide was particularly telling. He had maintained his innocence and participated in search efforts for 2 days after Sydney's disappearance. But as the investigation intensified and as investigators began asking more pointed questions about his role in Sydney's disappearance, the pressure apparently became too much for him to bear. Law enforcement officials immediately began treating John Cornell as the primary suspect in Sydney's disappearance. His suicide didn't legally prove his guilt, but it provided strong circumstantial evidence that he had been involved in whatever had happened to Sydney. The focus of the investigation shifted from finding Sydney alive to determining what John Cornell had done to her and locating her body. The search efforts took on a new urgency and a more somber tone. Volunteers and law enforcement officers were no longer looking for a living girl who might be hiding or being held somewhere. They were now searching for evidence of a crime and, most likely, for Sydney's remains. The area around Walnut Ridge is characterized by dense forests, rivers, and numerous remote locations where a body could be hidden. The Black River, which flows through the region, became a particular focus of the search efforts. Investigators understood that if John Cornell had murdered Sydney, he would have needed to dispose of her body somewhere, and the river system offered numerous possibilities for concealment. The community's response to John Cornell's suicide was complex. On one hand, there was anger that he had apparently taken the coward's way out rather than facing justice for whatever he had done to Sydney. On the other hand, there was a grim satisfaction in knowing that the person responsible for Sydney's disappearance would never be able to hurt another child. For Denise Cornell, John's suicide created a complicated mix of emotions. She was grieving the loss of her husband while simultaneously grappling with the likelihood that he had murdered her daughter. The man she had trusted to help raise Sydney, the man she had shared a bed with and built a life with, had apparently been capable of the most heinous betrayal imaginable. The investigation now faced the challenge of building a case against a dead suspect. While John Cornell's suicide strongly suggested his guilt, investigators still needed to gather evidence that would conclusively prove what had happened to Sydney. They needed to find her body, establish the cause of death, and collect any physical evidence that would support their theory of the case. With John Cornell's death confirming investigators' worst suspicions, the search for Sydney Randall took on a new dimension. No longer were they hoping to find a frightened but living teenager, they were now conducting what amounted to a recovery operation for a homicide victim. The question was no longer whether Sydney was alive, but where John Cornell had hidden her body. The search area was vast and challenging. Lawrence County and the surrounding regions of northeastern Arkansas are characterized by dense forests, numerous waterways, abandoned structures, and countless remote locations where a body could be concealed. The Black River system, in particular, presented both opportunities and challenges for the search teams. Law enforcement agencies coordinated a massive search effort that would continue for weeks. The Arkansas State Police took the lead, working closely with the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office, the Randolph County Sheriff's Office, and other local agencies. Specialized search and rescue teams were brought in, including teams with expertise in underwater recovery operations. The community response to the search was remarkable. Hundreds of volunteers continued to participate in the organized search efforts, even after it became clear that they were looking for Sydney's body rather than hoping to find her alive. These volunteers included Sydney's friends, family members, and complete strangers who were moved by the tragedy and wanted to help bring some measure of closure to the case. The searches were systematically organized to ensure maximum coverage of the potential disposal sites. Teams would be assigned specific areas to search, with careful documentation of what areas had been covered and what had been found. The terrain was often difficult, with searchers having to navigate through dense underbrush, steep riverbanks, and muddy or swampy conditions. One of the challenges investigators faced was determining where John Cornell might have taken Sydney's body. They had to consider factors such as how much time he had available, how far he could have traveled, and what locations he might have been familiar with. They also had to consider practical factors such as accessibility by vehicle and the likelihood that a disposal site would remain undisturbed. The Black River became a particular focus of the search efforts. Rivers are common disposal sites for homicide victims because the water can help conceal evidence and because bodies in water can be carried far from the original disposal location. However, searching a river system is extremely challenging and resource-intensive, requiring specialized equipment and personnel. Dive teams were brought in to search portions of the Black River and other waterways in the area. These highly trained specialists used sonar equipment and underwater cameras to search areas that would be impossible to examine from the surface. The work was dangerous and difficult, made more challenging by the muddy water and strong currents typical of Arkansas rivers. As the days turned into weeks, the massive search effort continued without success. Each day that passed without finding Sydney's body was another day of agony for her family and another day of frustration for the investigators working the case. The volunteers who had initially joined the search with hope and determination were beginning to show signs of fatigue and discouragement. Media coverage of the case remained intense throughout this period. Sydney's story had captured public attention across Arkansas and beyond, and news outlets continued to report on the search efforts and any developments in the case. The sustained media attention helped keep volunteers engaged and ensured that potential witnesses who might have information about John Cornell's activities remained aware of the ongoing investigation. Despite the lack of success in finding Sydney's body, investigators continued to build their case against John Cornell. They were gathering evidence about his relationship with Sydney, his behavior in the days before her disappearance, and his activities during the crucial time period when she vanished. This evidence would be important not just for understanding what had happened, but also for providing closure to Sydney's family and the community. The psychological toll of the extended search was significant for everyone involved. Sydney's family members were trapped in a horrible state of limbo, knowing that she was dead but unable to properly grieve without recovering her body. The investigators working the case were dealing with the frustration of knowing who was responsible for Sydney's death but being unable to prove it conclusively without physical evidence. After more than 2 months of intensive searching, the break in Sydney Randall's case came from an unexpected source. On May 18, 2013, a local fisherman was enjoying a day on the Black River near Old Davidsonville State Park when he spotted something floating in the water that didn't belong there. What he had discovered would finally bring some answers to Sydney's family and to the investigators who had been working tirelessly to solve her case. The fisherman immediately contacted law enforcement, and investigators quickly responded to the scene. What they found was Sydney's body, which had been in the water for over 2 months since her disappearance in March. The location where she was discovered was approximately 1 mile south of Old Davidsonville State Park, in an area that had been searched multiple times during the extensive recovery efforts. The discovery of Sydney's body was both a relief and a tragedy for her family. On one hand, they finally had answers about what had happened to her, and they could begin the process of laying her to rest and finding some measure of closure. On the other hand, the discovery confirmed their worst fears and marked the definitive end of any hope that she might somehow still be alive. For the investigators working Sydney's case, the discovery of her body was a crucial development that would allow them to gather physical evidence and officially determine the cause of death. The body was carefully recovered from the river and transported to the Arkansas State Medical Examiner's office for a complete autopsy and forensic analysis. The location where Sydney's body was found provided important clues about John Cornell's actions on the night he murdered her. The area near Old Davidsonville State Park was relatively remote and accessible by vehicle, making it a logical choice for someone trying to dispose of a body. The fact that Sydney's body was found in the Black River also explained why the extensive land searches had been unsuccessful. She had been in the water the entire time. The condition of Sydney's body after more than 2 months in the river presented challenges for the forensic examination, but it also preserved certain types of evidence that would prove crucial to the case. Water can actually help preserve some forms of physical evidence, and the medical examiner would be able to gather important information about how Sydney had died and what had happened to her before her death. The recovery of Sydney's body marked a turning point in the case from a community perspective as well. The massive volunteer search efforts that had characterized the previous 2 months could finally be called off. The hundreds of people who had donated their time and energy to looking for Sydney could now focus on supporting her family through the grieving process and celebrating her life rather than searching for her remains. News of Sydney's discovery spread quickly through Walnut Ridge and the surrounding communities. For many people who had been following the case and participating in the search efforts, the news brought a complex mix of emotions. There was sadness that Sydney was indeed dead, but also a sense of relief that she had been found and that her family could finally have some closure. The discovery also refocused attention on John Cornell's actions and motivations. With Sydney's body now recovered, investigators could begin to piece together a more complete picture of what had happened during those crucial hours when both Sydney and John were missing from the Cornell home. The physical evidence that would be gathered from Sydney's body would help tell the story of her final hours. The media coverage of Sydney's discovery was extensive, with news outlets across the region reporting on the development. The story had captured public attention when Sydney first disappeared, and the discovery of her body provided a tragic conclusion to a case that many people had been following closely. For Denise Cornell, Sydney's mother, the discovery brought an end to the agonizing uncertainty that had characterized the previous 2 months. While the news was devastating, it also allowed her to begin planning Sydney's funeral and to start the long process of grieving for her daughter while also coming to terms with her husband's betrayal. The autopsy and forensic examination of Sydney Randall's body would provide crucial evidence about how she died and what had happened to her in her final hours. The Arkansas State Medical Examiner's office conducted a thorough examination, despite the challenges presented by the body's condition after spending more than 2 months in the Black River. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. Sydney had been struck multiple times with a heavy object, causing fatal injuries to her skull and brain. The nature and severity of the injuries indicated that this had been a violent, deliberate attack rather than an accident or a single blow struck in a moment of anger. Perhaps even more disturbing than the cause of death were the additional findings from the forensic examination. Evidence indicated that Sydney had been sexually abused, confirming the worst fears that her biological father Victor Randall had expressed about John Cornell's relationship with his daughter. The physical evidence supported the theory that John Cornell had been molesting Sydney, and that her murder may have been connected to his attempts to silence her or prevent her from reporting his abuse. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence recovered during the examination was DNA material found on Sydney's body and underneath her fingernails. Forensic analysis confirmed that this DNA belonged to John Cornell, providing a direct physical link between him and Sydney's murder. This evidence was particularly significant because it indicated that Sydney had fought back against her attacker, managing to scratch him and collect his DNA under her nails in the process. The DNA evidence was devastating proof of John Cornell's guilt. While his suicide had already strongly suggested his involvement in Sydney's death, the physical evidence removed any doubt about his responsibility for her murder. It also provided some measure of satisfaction to know that Sydney had not gone quietly. She had fought against her killer and had helped provide the evidence that would ultimately prove his guilt. The forensic evidence also helped investigators understand the timeline of Sydney's murder. Based on the condition of her body and other factors, they were able to determine that she had likely been killed shortly after she and John Cornell left the house on the night of March 9 or early morning of March 10. This meant that while Sydney's mother was sleeping peacefully in her bed, her daughter was being murdered by the man Denise trusted to protect her. The evidence gathered from Sydney's body also helped investigators understand what had happened after her murder. John Cornell had transported her body to the area near Old Davidsonville State Park and disposed of it in the Black River. He had then returned home to maintain the pretense that he didn't know what had happened to Sydney, participating in the early stages of the search efforts while knowing exactly where her body was located. The release of the forensic findings was another traumatic experience for Sydney's family, particularly her mother Denise. Learning the details of how her daughter had died, and confirmation that she had been sexually abused, added another layer of horror to an already devastating situation. The knowledge that the man she had married and trusted had been abusing and had ultimately murdered her daughter was almost too much to bear. The forensic evidence also provided validation for Victor Randall, Sydney's biological father, who had suspected that John Cornell was abusing his daughter. His instincts had been correct, but unfortunately, his concerns hadn't been enough to prevent the tragedy. The guilt and regret that Victor felt about not being able to protect his daughter would be something he would have to carry for the rest of his life. From a legal standpoint, the forensic evidence would have been more than sufficient to convict John Cornell of Sydney's murder if he had lived to stand trial. The DNA evidence, combined with the circumstances of Sydney's disappearance and John's subsequent suicide, created an overwhelming case that would have been virtually impossible for any defense attorney to overcome. The completed forensic examination allowed Arkansas State Police to officially close Sydney's case. While there would never be a trial or a formal conviction, the evidence clearly established that John Cornell was responsible for Sydney's death. The case was solved, even though justice in the traditional sense could never be achieved because the perpetrator was dead. The resolution of Sydney Randall's case brought closure to the intensive investigation, but it also marked the beginning of a long healing process for her family and the Walnut Ridge community. The impact of Sydney's murder extended far beyond the immediate tragedy, affecting everyone who had known her and many who had simply followed her story in the media. For Denise Cornell, Sydney's mother, the aftermath of the case was particularly complex and painful. She had lost both her daughter and her husband, but under circumstances that made grieving extremely difficult. While she mourned Sydney's death, she also had to grapple with the knowledge that her husband had been a monster who had been abusing and ultimately murdered her child. The betrayal was profound and would affect her ability to trust others for years to come. Denise had to confront the painful reality that signs of John Cornell's abuse of Sydney might have been present, but that she had missed them or misinterpreted them. The guilt associated with this realization was overwhelming. As Sydney's mother, she felt that her primary responsibility had been to protect her daughter, and in her mind, she had failed in that most basic parental duty. Victor Randall, Sydney's biological father, also struggled with guilt and regret in the aftermath of the case. He had suspected that John Cornell was abusing Sydney and had tried to intervene, but his efforts had been insufficient to save his daughter's life. The knowledge that his instincts had been correct provided no comfort. In fact, it made the tragedy even more painful because it suggested that Sydney's death might have been preventable. The extended family members and Sydney's friends also struggled to process what had happened. Many of them had interacted with John Cornell regularly and had never suspected that he was capable of such horrific acts. The case served as a stark reminder that predators often hide in plain sight, appearing normal and trustworthy while committing terrible crimes behind closed doors. The Walnut Ridge community was deeply affected by Sydney's murder. The town's residents had participated extensively in the search efforts, and many had developed a personal investment in finding Sydney and bringing her home safely. The discovery that she had been murdered by her stepfather was a shock that reverberated throughout the community. The case also had broader implications for how child abuse cases are handled and investigated. Sydney's murder highlighted the importance of taking children's reports of abuse seriously and acting quickly to protect them. It also demonstrated the need for better communication between divorced parents, social services, and law enforcement when concerns about child abuse arise. Educational efforts emerged from Sydney's case, with child welfare advocates using her story to promote awareness about the signs of child abuse and the importance of speaking up when concerns arise. Sydney's death became a catalyst for conversations about how communities can better protect their most vulnerable members. The media coverage of Sydney's case also had lasting effects. Her story had captured public attention not just in Arkansas but across the country, and it became a reference point for discussions about child safety and the dangers that children can face within their own families. True crime enthusiasts and researchers continue to study Sydney's case as an example of how child predators operate and how warning signs can be missed. For law enforcement agencies involved in the case, Sydney's murder served as a reminder of the importance of thorough investigation techniques and the value of forensic evidence in solving crimes. The DNA evidence that ultimately proved John Cornell's guilt demonstrated how advances in forensic science can provide justice even in the most challenging cases. The case also highlighted the importance of community involvement in missing person cases. The massive volunteer search effort that characterized Sydney's case, while ultimately unsuccessful in finding her alive, demonstrated the power of community solidarity and the lengths to which people will go to help a family in crisis. Sydney's funeral, when it was finally held after the discovery and examination of her body, was attended by hundreds of people from Walnut Ridge and the surrounding communities. The service was a celebration of her life and a collective expression of grief for a young woman whose life had been cut tragically short. As we reach the end of Sydney Randall's story, it's important to remember that behind all the investigative details and forensic evidence was a real person, a 14-year-old girl with hopes, dreams, and a future that was stolen from her by someone who should have protected her. Sydney Nicole Randall was more than just a victim of a horrific crime. She was a daughter, a friend, a student, and a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She enjoyed beauty pageants, spending time with friends, and all the typical activities that make up a teenager's life. She had plans and aspirations that will never be fulfilled, relationships that will never develop, and experiences that will never be had. The tragedy of Sydney's case extends beyond her individual murder to encompass the broader issue of child abuse and the failure of the systems that are supposed to protect children. Sydney had tried to communicate her fears about John Cornell to friends and family members, but the adults around her were either unable or unwilling to recognize the full extent of the danger she was facing. Her story serves as a stark reminder that child predators often operate within families and that the people who are supposed to protect children can sometimes be their greatest threats. It also highlights the importance of listening to children when they express concerns about adults in their lives, even when those concerns seem difficult to believe or act upon. The investigation into Sydney's disappearance and murder was notable for its scope and intensity. The massive search effort that characterized the case demonstrated both the dedication of law enforcement agencies and the compassion of the Walnut Ridge community. While the searchers were ultimately unable to find Sydney alive, their efforts ensured that her case received the attention and resources it deserved. The forensic evidence that ultimately solved Sydney's case represents both a triumph of modern investigative techniques and a tragic confirmation of the worst fears about what had happened to her. The DNA evidence that linked John Cornell to Sydney's murder provided definitive proof of his guilt, but it also confirmed that Sydney had suffered terribly in her final moments. Today, Sydney is remembered not just as a victim, but as a symbol of the need for greater vigilance in protecting children from abuse. Her story has become part of the broader conversation about child safety and the responsibility that all adults have to speak up when they suspect that a child is being harmed. The case also serves as a reminder of the ripple effects of violent crime. Sydney's murder didn't just end her life, it devastated her family, traumatized her community, and affected everyone who worked on her case or followed her story. The impacts of her death will continue to be felt for years to come. For those who knew Sydney personally, she is remembered as much more than the circumstances of her death. Her friends remember her laughter, her kindness, and her dreams for the future. Her family remembers a bright, beautiful girl who brought joy to their lives and who deserved so much better than the fate that befell her. The location where Sydney's body was found, near Old Davidsonville State Park along the Black River, has become a place of remembrance for some who knew her. The natural beauty of the area provides a peaceful setting for reflection and remembrance, a stark contrast to the violence that brought Sydney there. In the years since Sydney's murder, her case has been studied by criminologists, child welfare advocates, and law enforcement professionals as an example of how child abuse cases can escalate to murder when proper interventions don't occur. Her story has become part of training materials used to educate social workers, teachers, and others who work with children about the warning signs of abuse and the importance of taking action when concerns arise. The Walnut Ridge community has also learned from Sydney's case. The tragedy has made residents more aware of the need to watch out for the children in their community and to speak up when they have concerns about a child's welfare. In some ways, Sydney's death has made her hometown a safer place for other children, as her story serves as a constant reminder of the vigilance required to protect the vulnerable. For law enforcement, Sydney's case reinforced the importance of taking child abuse allegations seriously and acting quickly to investigate them. The case also demonstrated the value of thorough forensic analysis in providing closure for families and justice for victims, even when the perpetrator cannot be brought to trial. As we conclude Sydney's story tonight, we do so with the hope that her tragic death will serve as a catalyst for positive change in how we protect children and respond to abuse. She deserved better than the life she was given, and she certainly deserved better than the death she suffered. While we cannot bring Sydney back, we can honor her memory by working to ensure that other children are protected from similar fates. Sydney Nicole Randall was 14 years old when her life was cut short by the very person who should have been keeping her safe. She was a victim of the worst kind of betrayal, murdered by someone who had promised to care for her. But she was also a fighter who left behind DNA evidence that would ultimately prove her killer's guilt. In her final moments, even as she faced death, Sydney helped ensure that the truth about what happened to her would eventually come to light. Her story reminds us that behind every true crime case is a real person with real dreams, real fears, and real relationships. Sydney was someone's daughter, someone's friend, and someone whose absence has left a permanent hole in the lives of those who loved her. As we remember her tonight, we do so not just as a victim of crime, but as a young woman whose life had value and meaning beyond the tragic circumstances of her death. Rest in peace, Sydney Nicole Randall. Your story will not be forgotten, and your memory will continue to inspire efforts to protect other children from the dangers you faced. Though your life was short, your impact will be lasting, and you will be remembered not just for how you died, but for how you lived and for the light you brought to the world during your brief time here. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, I want to tell you a story that unfolded over nearly a decade in Lubbock, Texas. It's a story about a young woman named Zoe Campos, whose life was cut tragically short at just 18 years old. This is a case that remained unsolved for 5 long years, leaving a family desperate for answers and a community haunted by questions. To understand this story, we first need to understand who Zoe Campos was. In November of 2013, Zoe was an 18-year-old living in Lubbock, Texas, a sprawling city in the heart of West Texas, known for its cotton fields, Texas Tech University, and tight-knit communities. Zoe was at that pivotal age where childhood meets adulthood. She had recently graduated high school and was navigating those first steps into independence. She had her own apartment, which represented freedom and possibility, the chance to make her own choices, to stay up late, to have friends over whenever she wanted. Like many young people her age, Zoe was close to her family, particularly her sister Savannah. The two sisters had that special bond that comes from shared experiences, inside jokes, and the comfort of knowing someone would always be there for you. They would spend evenings together, watching movies, talking about their days, and simply enjoying each other's company. Zoe's mother worked evening shifts, which meant that Zoe often helped out by picking her up from work late at night. It was one of those small family responsibilities that showed her caring nature, the kind of young woman who would drive across town at 1:30 in the morning just to make sure her mother got home safely. But Lubbock, like any city, had its hidden dangers. It's a place where college students and young adults often find themselves in situations they're not quite prepared for. The city has its share of nightlife, parties, and the kind of social connections that can sometimes lead young people into unpredictable circumstances. In 2013, social media was becoming increasingly important in how young people met and communicated. Text messages, phone calls, and online connections were creating new ways for people to meet, but also new risks and vulnerabilities that previous generations hadn't faced. Zoe was navigating this world like millions of other young adults across America. She was making new friends, meeting new people, and experiencing the freedom that comes with being 18. But on November 17, 2013, one of these new connections would lead to a tragic end to her young life. November 17, 2013, started like any other Sunday for Zoe Campos. The weather in Lubbock was typical for mid-November, cool but not yet the bitter cold that West Texas winters can bring. It was the kind of day where you might wear a light jacket, where the autumn air had that crisp quality that makes everything feel fresh and full of possibility. Zoe spent the earlier part of the day in her apartment, probably doing the kinds of things any 18-year-old might do on a weekend, maybe catching up on shows, texting friends, or just enjoying the luxury of having no immediate responsibilities. As evening approached, Zoe made plans with her sister Savannah. The two decided to go out to dinner, one of those simple sister bonding experiences that seemed so ordinary at the time but would later become precious final memories for Savannah. They chose a restaurant somewhere in Lubbock, probably one of the casual dining places that college towns are known for. Can you picture them sitting across from each other, maybe sharing an appetizer, talking about their weeks, laughing about something silly? These are the moments that families treasure after tragedy strikes, the last normal conversation, the last shared meal, the last time everything felt safe and predictable. After dinner, they returned to Zoe's apartment to watch a movie. This was their routine, sisters spending quality time together, the kind of evening that happens thousands of times across America every night. They probably debated what to watch, maybe settled on something comfortable and familiar, the kind of movie you put on when you just want to relax and enjoy each other's company. But as the movie ended, Zoe mentioned something that would later become crucial to understanding what happened next. She told Savannah that she was planning to hang out with a friend before going to pick their mother up from work. Now, this is where the story begins to take a different turn. Savannah didn't know who this friend was. In a close family like theirs, where the sisters regularly shared details about their social lives, this was unusual. Zoe was typically open about her plans and the people she was spending time with. The friend Zoe mentioned was someone named Carlos Rodriguez. To Savannah and the rest of Zoe's family, this was a name they'd never heard before. He wasn't part of their regular social circle, Wasn't someone from high school or work or any of the usual places where you might expect an 18-year-old to meet friends. This detail, the unknown friend, would later become one of the most important clues in the entire case. But at the time, Savannah probably didn't think much of it. When you're 18, you're constantly meeting new people, making new connections. It's natural and expected. So Savannah left Zoe's apartment that evening, probably with a casual goodbye, maybe plans to talk the next day. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last time she would ever see her sister alive. After Savannah left, Zoe prepared to meet this Carlos Rodriguez. We can only imagine what was going through her mind as she got ready. Was she excited about meeting someone new? Was this a potential romantic connection? Was it just a casual friendship? These are questions that would haunt investigators and Zoe's family for years to come. What we do know is that Zoe was planning a relatively simple evening. She would hang out with Carlos for a while, then drive across town to pick up her mother from work. It was the kind of plan that suggested she expected to be safe, that whatever she was doing with Carlos would be brief and straightforward. The last communication anyone had with Zoe was a text message she sent to her mother around 1:30 a.m. It was a simple message letting her mother know that she was on her way to pick her up from work. This text represents the last moment when Zoe's life was still following its expected path, when the night was still going according to plan. But Zoe never arrived to pick up her mother. She never sent another text, never made another phone call, never returned to her apartment. In the span of a few hours, Zoe Campo simply vanished from the world, leaving behind only questions and the growing fear that something had gone terribly wrong. When Zoe didn't show up to pick up her mother from work that night, it created the first ripple of concern in what would become a wave of panic and desperation. Her mother waited, probably checking her phone repeatedly, maybe calling Zoe's number and getting no answer. At first, there might have been reasonable explanations. Maybe Zoe's phone had died. Maybe she'd gotten distracted or lost track of time. When you're 18, time can sometimes slip away from you, especially when you're socializing with friends. Her mother probably felt that familiar mixture of irritation and worry that parents know well, annoyed that Zoe hadn't called, but not yet truly frightened. But as the hours passed and Zoe remained unreachable, that low-level concern began to transform into something more serious. This wasn't like Zoe. She was responsible, especially when it came to family obligations. She wouldn't just disappear without explanation, wouldn't leave her mother stranded at work without a word. By the next morning, Zoe's family knew something was wrong. They began calling her friends, checking with people who might have seen her or heard from her. But they quickly discovered something troubling. None of Zoe's usual friends knew where she was or who she had been planning to meet. The name Carlos Rodriguez meant nothing to them. He wasn't part of Zoe's regular social circle, wasn't someone her friends recognized or could provide information about. This made the situation even more frightening because it suggested that Zoe had been involved with someone completely outside her normal life, someone her support system couldn't help track down. Her family filed a missing person report with the Lubbock Police Department. Imagine the difficulty of that conversation, trying to explain to officers that your daughter, your sister, had simply vanished after mentioning plans to meet someone none of you had ever heard of. The police began their initial investigation, but missing person cases involving young adults can be challenging. 18-year-olds are legally adults, free to go where they want and see who they want. Unless there's immediate evidence of foul play, law enforcement often has to balance respecting an adult's autonomy with investigating genuine disappearances. But Zoe's family knew this was different. They knew their daughter, their sister. This wasn't a case of a young adult acting impulsively or deciding to disappear for a few days. Zoe was responsible, caring, and deeply connected to her family. She wouldn't just vanish without explanation. The first few days of a disappearance are crucial, and they're also the most emotionally devastating for families. Every hour that passes without contact increases both the urgency of the search and the fear of what might have happened. Zoe's family found themselves living in a state of suspended animation, unable to move forward with their normal lives, but also unable to do anything concrete to find her. They probably spent those first days calling her phone over and over, hoping to hear her voice. They likely drove around Lubbock, checking places she might go, looking for any sign of her car or any clue about where she might be. The familiar city probably began to feel strange and threatening, full of shadows and possibilities they'd never considered before. Social media became both a tool and a source of torment. They could use platforms like Facebook to spread the word about Zoe's disappearance, to ask friends and acquaintances to share information. But they also had to face the reality that Zoe's own social media accounts had gone silent, that the digital footprint every young person leaves was suddenly frozen in time. The not knowing was perhaps the worst part. Was Zoe hurt somewhere, unable to call for help? Had she been in an accident? Had someone taken her against her will? Or, and this was the hope they clung to, was there some explanation they hadn't thought of, some reason she couldn't contact them that would eventually resolve with her safe return? 3 days after Zoe's disappearance, her family received what seemed like their first break in the case, but it would actually make the mystery even more disturbing. 3 days after Zoe Campos vanished, her aunt was driving through Lubbock when she spotted something that made her heart race: Zoe's car, being driven by a man she didn't recognize. Imagine the shock of that moment. For 3 days, Zoe's family had been wondering where she was, fearing the worst but still hoping for the best. And suddenly, there was her car, proof that someone else was involved in her disappearance, but also proof that whatever had happened to Zoe, it wasn't something simple like a breakdown or an accident. The aunt immediately began following the car, probably with her pulse pounding and her mind racing. Who was this man? Where was Zoe? Was she in the car too, perhaps in the back seat where the aunt couldn't see her? These questions must have flooded through her mind as she tried to keep the vehicle in sight. But following someone through city traffic is harder than it looks in movies. The unknown driver eventually managed to lose her, disappearing into the maze of Lubbock streets. The aunt was left with more questions than answers, but at least now the family knew that Zoe's disappearance wasn't just a case of her choosing to be out of contact. Shortly after this sighting, Zoe's car was found abandoned at an apartment complex on Utica Avenue. The discovery of the vehicle marked a turning point in the investigation. Now the police had physical evidence, something concrete to examine for clues about what had happened to Zoe. The location where the car was found became significant. Utica Avenue wasn't a random location, it was in a specific part of Lubbock, near certain neighborhoods and apartment complexes. Investigators would have immediately begun canvassing the area, looking for witnesses who might have seen who abandoned the car or when it had been left there. The condition of the car was also important. Was it damaged? Were there signs of a struggle inside? Had anything been left behind that might provide clues about Zoe's fate or the identity of whoever had been driving it? These details weren't immediately released to the public, but they became crucial pieces of the investigative puzzle. For Zoe's family, finding the car abandoned was both a relief and a new source of terror. On one hand, it confirmed that they were right to be worried. This wasn't a case of Zoe simply choosing to be out of contact. Someone had clearly taken her car, which meant someone had likely taken Zoe as well. But the abandoned car also raised terrifying new questions. If someone had been driving Zoe's car for 3 days after her disappearance, where was Zoe herself? Why would someone abandon the car in a random apartment complex? What had happened during those 3 days between her disappearance and the car being found? The investigation now had a physical location to focus on, a tangible piece of evidence. Detectives would have processed the car thoroughly, looking for fingerprints, DNA evidence, or any other clues that might lead them to Zoe or to whoever had taken her. They would have also expanded their search to include the area around where the car was found. Were there security cameras that might have captured who abandoned the vehicle? Were there residents of the apartment complex who had seen anything suspicious? Had anyone noticed the car sitting there for any length of time before it was officially discovered? But even with this new evidence, the case remained frustratingly mysterious. The police still didn't know who Carlos Rodriguez was or how to find him. They still didn't know what had happened to Zoe after she left her apartment to meet him. And they still didn't know whether she was alive somewhere, needing rescue, or whether they were now investigating something much worse. The abandoned car was like a breadcrumb in a dark forest. It proved they were on some kind of trail, but it didn't show them where that trail was leading or how much further they would have to go to find answers. What the family didn't know at the time was that this discovery was just the beginning of a much longer and more complex investigation, one that would test their endurance and challenge their faith in the justice system for years to come. With Zoe's car found abandoned and evidence that someone else had been driving it, the Lubbock Police Department intensified their efforts to locate the mysterious Carlos Rodriguez. This name, mentioned to Savannah as the friend Zoe planned to meet, had become their primary lead in a case that was growing more troubling by the day. In 2013, finding someone based on just a name wasn't as straightforward as it might be today. While social media existed, it wasn't as comprehensive or as easily searchable as it would become in later years. Phone records became crucial in this search, as investigators worked to trace the communications between Zoe and this unknown Carlos. The breakthrough came when detectives analyzed Zoe's phone records. They discovered that the last phone call on Zoe's phone had been with someone listed as Carlos Rodriguez. This wasn't just family testimony anymore, it was concrete evidence that Zoe had indeed been in contact with this person on the night she disappeared. With phone records providing a number, investigators could begin the process of tracking down Carlos Rodriguez. They would have used various databases and investigative tools to connect the phone number to an address, to build a profile of who this person was and where they could find him. When police finally located Carlos Rodriguez, they found a young man who seemed, on the surface, unremarkable. He wasn't a known criminal with a lengthy record. He wasn't someone who immediately stood out as dangerous or suspicious. This is often the case in criminal investigations. The perpetrators are frequently people who blend into normal society, who don't fit the dramatic stereotypes we see in movies and television. The initial questioning of Carlos took place in what was likely a standard interview room at the Lubbock Police Department. Detectives would have approached this conversation carefully, knowing that they needed to gather as much information as possible without alerting Carlos to just how much of a suspect he had become. Carlos's story, when he finally told it, seemed plausible on the surface. He claimed that he and Zoe were acquaintances, not close friends, but people who knew each other casually. This might have explained why Zoe's family wasn't familiar with him. Casual acquaintances don't always get mentioned in family conversations. According to Carlos, he and Zoe had made plans to meet that night to smoke marijuana together. This detail added a layer of complexity to the case. If true, it meant that Zoe had been involved in illegal drug use, which might have made her family and friends less likely to know about the relationship. Carlos told investigators that when Zoe arrived at his home that evening, he realized he didn't actually have any marijuana available. According to his account, Zoe left to go find some drugs elsewhere and simply never returned. He claimed he didn't know what had happened to her after she left his house. This story had elements that seemed believable. Drug deals and casual marijuana use often involve people who aren't deeply connected to each other's social circles. It's common for people to make plans around drug use and for those plans to fall through or change unexpectedly. And if Zoe had left Carlos's house to find marijuana elsewhere, it was possible she had encountered trouble or danger from a completely different source. But investigators noticed some troubling inconsistencies in Carlos's story. If Zoe had left his house to find drugs and never returned, why hadn't he tried to contact her? Why hadn't he seemed concerned when she didn't come back or respond to calls and texts? And most importantly, how did her car end up being driven by a stranger 3 days later? Carlos couldn't provide satisfactory answers to these questions. He claimed he hadn't been worried when Zoe didn't return, that he had simply assumed she had changed her mind or found something better to do. He denied any knowledge of what had happened to her car or who might have been driving it. Despite these inconsistencies, investigators didn't have enough evidence to arrest Carlos at this point. His story, while suspicious, wasn't impossible. And without Zoe's body or clear evidence of foul play, they couldn't prove that a crime had even been committed, let alone that Carlos was responsible for it. So Carlos Rodriguez was released, but he wasn't forgotten. The police kept him on their radar, understanding that he was their best and only lead in Zoe's disappearance. They would continue to monitor him, hoping that either new evidence would emerge or that Carlos himself might make a mistake that would reveal the truth about what had happened that night. What investigators didn't know at the time was that Carlos would indeed make mistakes, but it would take years for those mistakes to finally lead to justice for Zoe Campos. After the initial investigation failed to produce an arrest, the Zoe Campos case entered that most difficult phase for families of missing persons, the long, uncertain wait for answers. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and still there was no sign of Zoe, no breakthrough in the case, no resolution to the nightmare her family was living. For Zoe's mother, sister, and extended family, this period was a special kind of torture. Unlike families dealing with other types of tragedy, they couldn't even begin to grieve properly because they didn't know what had happened. Was Zoe dead? Had she been kidnapped and taken somewhere far away? Was she being held against her will, hoping for rescue? Or was there still some possibility, however remote, that she would walk through the door one day with an explanation for her disappearance? This uncertainty affects every aspect of a family's life. How do you celebrate holidays when one of your loved ones is missing? How do you plan for the future when you don't know if that person will be part of it? How do you answer well-meaning friends and relatives who ask for updates when you have no updates to give? Zoe's family became reluctant experts in the world of missing persons advocacy. They learned about search techniques, about how police investigations work, about the legal complexities surrounding adult disappearances. They organized searches, distributed flyers, and maintained social media pages dedicated to keeping Zoe's case in the public eye. The searches were particularly heartbreaking. Imagine spending your weekends walking through fields and vacant lots, looking for any sign of your missing family member. Every piece of trash, every unusual disturbance in the ground, every item of clothing spotted from a distance could be the clue you've been searching for, or just another dead end that deepens your despair. As time passed, Zoe's case began to receive less media attention. This is the unfortunate reality of missing person cases. Unless there are dramatic developments, the public's attention inevitably moves on to other stories. For families, this fading interest feels like a second abandonment, as if the world is forgetting their loved one just when they need help the most. The family also had to confront the possibility that Zoe might have been the victim of human trafficking. Lubbock sits along major highway corridors that are known routes for trafficking operations. Young women, particularly those who might be vulnerable or isolated, are frequent targets for these criminal networks. The thought that Zoe might have been trafficked was both terrifying and, in some ways, hopeful. It was terrifying because it suggested she might be enduring ongoing suffering somewhere. But it was also hopeful because it meant she might still be alive, might still be rescued if the right information emerged. During this period, Carlos Rodriguez remained on investigators' radar, but he had seemingly moved on with his life. He wasn't arrested, wasn't charged with anything related to Zoe's disappearance. To outside observers, he appeared to be just another young man living in Lubbock, working, socializing, going about his daily routine. But appearances can be deceiving. In 2017, 4 years after Zoe's disappearance, Carlos was arrested on an unrelated charge, stalking. This arrest was significant not because of the charge itself, but because it demonstrated a pattern of problematic behavior toward women. Stalking is often part of a continuum of escalating behavior that can include more serious crimes. The stalking charge resulted in Carlos being sentenced to 4 years in prison. For Zoe's family, this development was bittersweet. On one hand, they might have felt some satisfaction knowing that the person they suspected of harming Zoe was facing consequences for something. On the other hand, it wasn't justice for Zoe, and it didn't bring them any closer to understanding what had happened to her. What the family didn't know was that Carlos's imprisonment would eventually become a crucial factor in solving Zoe's case. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways, following paths that couldn't have been predicted when the crime was first committed. During these long years of uncertainty, Zoe's family had to find ways to continue living while carrying the weight of not knowing. They had to maintain hope while preparing for the worst. They had to keep pushing for answers while accepting that those answers might never come. It's a kind of strength that most people never have to develop, the ability to live with profound uncertainty, to continue fighting for truth even when that fight seems hopeless. Zoe's family demonstrated this strength every day for years, never giving up on finding out what had happened to their daughter and sister. They couldn't have known that in 2018, 5 years after Zoe vanished, a series of events would finally begin to unravel the truth about that terrible night in November 2013. In 2018, exactly 5 years after Zoe Campos disappeared, investigators received the kind of tip that can change everything in a cold case. Someone contacted the police with information about Zoe's disappearance, information that would lead them to a backyard in Lubbock and, eventually, to the truth about what had happened that November night in 2013. The nature of this tip wasn't immediately revealed to the public, but it was specific enough and credible enough to prompt investigators to obtain search warrants and begin digging in a very particular location. This wasn't a random search based on a vague hunch. Someone had provided information that directed police to a specific piece of property. The property in question was significant. It was close to Carlos Rodriguez's family's old home. This wasn't a coincidence. After years of circumstantial evidence and suspicion, investigators finally had information that directly connected Carlos to a specific location where Zoe's remains might be found. The search team that descended on this property would have included detectives, forensic specialists, and possibly cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains. These searches are methodical and painstaking processes. Every shovelful of dirt is carefully examined, every potential piece of evidence is documented and preserved. During the initial search, investigators found a bone. For Zoe's family, this discovery represented both hope and terror, hope that they might finally have answers, but terror about what those answers might be. After 5 years of not knowing, the possibility of confirmation that Zoe was dead was both a relief and a devastating blow. The bone was sent for analysis to determine whether it was human and, if so, whether it might belong to Zoe. These forensic processes take time, and the wait for results would have been excruciating for everyone involved in the case. However, the initial bone discovery turned out to be a false lead. It belonged to an animal, not a human. But this didn't mean the search was over or that the tip had been worthless. Sometimes investigations involve following multiple leads, some of which don't pan out, before finding the crucial evidence. What was significant about this period was not just the physical search, but what was happening with Carlos Rodriguez himself. He was still in prison serving his sentence for the stalking conviction, and investigators decided to question him again about Zoe's disappearance. This time, the questioning was different. 5 years had passed since Zoe disappeared. Carlos had been in prison, possibly reflecting on his past actions. The discovery of the bone, even though it turned out to be from an animal, suggested that investigators were getting closer to the truth. When questioned from behind bars, Carlos's behavior changed dramatically. Previously, he had been willing to talk to police, to provide his version of events, to maintain his story about Zoe leaving his house to find marijuana. But this time, he requested a lawyer. Requesting legal counsel isn't evidence of guilt, it's a constitutional right that any person being questioned by police should exercise. But the timing was significant. Why, after years of being willing to discuss the case, did Carlos suddenly feel he needed legal representation? The answer came through jailhouse phone calls. In prison, phone conversations are typically recorded, and investigators monitoring Carlos's calls heard something remarkable. Carlos was reportedly heard saying that he had told somebody what happened to Zoe, and that person had snitched on him. This was the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for 5 years to hear. Carlos had just admitted, in his own words, that something had happened to Zoe, and that he had told someone about it. This wasn't the story he had been telling police, that Zoe had simply left his house and he didn't know what became of her. The recorded phone call provided investigators with probable cause to intensify their investigation of Carlos. They now had his own words suggesting that he knew more about Zoe's disappearance than he had previously admitted. They also had evidence that someone else knew what had happened, the person Carlos claimed had snitched on him. Armed with this new evidence, investigators prepared to confront Carlos again. But this time, they weren't just asking questions about a missing person case. They were preparing to solve a murder that had remained hidden for 5 years. The wheels of justice, which had seemed to be turning so slowly, were finally beginning to accelerate. After half a decade of uncertainty and frustration, Zoe's family was about to learn the truth about what had happened to their daughter and sister. The pressure of 5 years, the weight of his secret, and the realization that someone had betrayed his confidence finally broke Carlos Rodriguez. In a development that would bring both closure and heartbreak to Zoe's family, Carlos decided to confess to killing Zoe Campos. The confession didn't come all at once. It was a process that unfolded over time, as Carlos gradually revealed more details about what had really happened on November 17, 2013. The story he told was far different from the version he had given police years earlier. According to Carlos's confession, his initial story about planning to smoke marijuana with Zoe was partially true, but it was far from the complete truth. Carlos admitted that when Zoe came to his house that night, he was attracted to her and had hopes that their encounter might become romantic or sexual. Carlos revealed that he and Zoe did have sexual relations in his bedroom before they smoked what he described as K2, a synthetic marijuana that was known to be much more dangerous and unpredictable than regular marijuana. K2 and other synthetic drugs had been linked to violent behavior, hallucinations, and psychotic episodes. What Carlos described next was a nightmare scenario that explained 5 years of mystery and anguish. He claimed that after smoking the K2, he began to hallucinate and that in his altered state, he perceived Zoe as threatening. Specifically, he claimed he hallucinated that she was a demon. In this hallucinogenic state, Carlos attacked Zoe. He strangled her, continuing until she was dead. When the effects of the drug wore off, Carlos found himself faced with the horrific reality of what he had done. Zoe Campos, an 18-year-old woman who had come to his house for what she probably thought would be a casual evening, was dead. The confession explained many of the mysteries that had puzzled investigators for years. It explained why Zoe's family had never heard of Carlos. Their relationship was casual and new, not the kind of connection that would typically be discussed with family members. It explained why Zoe had told Savannah she was going to hang out with a friend. From Zoe's perspective, that's exactly what she thought she was doing. Carlos's confession also revealed what had happened in the days immediately following Zoe's murder. Panicked and trying to cover up his crime, Carlos had buried Zoe's body in his backyard. But he still had to deal with her car, which was sitting outside his house and could connect him to her disappearance. For 3 days, Carlos drove Zoe's car around Lubbock, probably trying to figure out what to do with it. This explained the sighting by Zoe's aunt. She had indeed seen a stranger driving her niece's car, and that stranger was Carlos Rodriguez, desperately trying to dispose of evidence of his crime. Eventually, Carlos abandoned Zoe's car at the apartment complex on Utica Avenue, where it was later found by police. He probably chose this location because it was far enough from his house to avoid connecting him to the vehicle, but accessible enough that he could walk or catch a ride home after leaving it there. The confession was both a relief and a source of new anguish for Zoe's family. After 5 years of not knowing, they finally had answers. They knew what had happened to Zoe, they knew who was responsible, and they knew that she hadn't suffered for years as a trafficking victim or in some other prolonged captivity. But the details of the confession were horrific. Learning that Zoe had been killed by someone she barely knew, during what should have been a safe social encounter, was devastating. The randomness of it, the fact that synthetic drugs had turned a casual evening into a murder, made the tragedy feel even more senseless. Based on Carlos's confession, investigators returned to search the property where he claimed to have buried Zoe's body. This time, their search was more focused and specific. Carlos had provided them with details about the location and depth of the burial site. The search teams worked carefully and methodically, knowing that they were not just looking for evidence but for the remains of a young woman whose family had been waiting 5 years to lay her to rest. When they finally found Zoe's remains and were able to confirm her identity through forensic analysis, it marked the end of one of the most agonizing chapters of the investigation. For Zoe's family, the discovery of Zoe's remains was simultaneously the answer to their prayers and the confirmation of their worst fears. After 5 years of hoping against hope that she might still be alive somewhere, they finally knew with certainty that their daughter and sister was gone. But they also knew that they could finally begin the process of proper grieving and could start working toward justice. The confession and discovery of remains transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a murder prosecution. Carlos Rodriguez would finally face the full consequences of his actions, but the legal process was far from over. In July 2019, Carlos Rodriguez did something that was both unusual and significant in the context of his case. While still incarcerated, he wrote a handwritten letter providing even more detailed information about Zoe's murder. This wasn't just another confession, it was a comprehensive account that seemed to be his attempt to tell what he called the whole truth. The letter began with Carlos expressing his emotional state after years of carrying the secret of what he had done. He wrote, "After 5 years of fear, guilt and shame, I can finally make peace with myself and God. I want the people in my community and on social media to know not just part of the truth, but the whole truth." This opening reveals something important about Carlos's psychological state during the 5 years between Zoe's murder and his confession. While Zoe's family was suffering through the agony of not knowing what had happened to their loved one, Carlos was dealing with his own internal torment, the knowledge of what he had done and the constant fear of being discovered. The letter went on to provide the most detailed account yet of what had happened on November 17, 2013. Carlos described meeting Zoe that evening and inviting her to his house. He admitted that he was attracted to her and that they had engaged in sexual relations before smoking the synthetic marijuana together. The description of what happened next was chilling. Carlos wrote about how the K2 caused him to hallucinate, specifically that Zoe appeared to him as a demon. In his altered state, he attacked her, choking her until she died. The letter provided a window into a mind that had been fundamentally altered by synthetic drugs, leading to a tragic and senseless death. What's particularly striking about this written confession is Carlos's apparent desire to take full responsibility for his actions while also explaining the role that synthetic drugs played in the crime. He wasn't trying to excuse what he had done, but he was trying to provide context for how a casual evening had turned into murder. The timing of this written confession is also significant. By 2019, Carlos had been living with the knowledge of his crime for nearly 6 years. The initial police investigation, the years of being suspected but not charged, his arrest on unrelated charges, and finally his verbal confession had all led to this moment where he felt compelled to provide a complete written account. Despite having Carlos's confession, both verbal and written, and despite having found Zoe's remains, the legal process was far from over. The case still needed to work its way through the court system, and there were legal complexities to navigate. One of the challenges in prosecuting Carlos was his claim that synthetic drugs had caused his violent behavior. While this didn't excuse the murder, it potentially affected what charges he could face and what sentence he might receive. The prosecution had to balance seeking justice for Zoe while acknowledging the role that dangerous synthetic drugs had played in the crime. The legal proceedings dragged on for several more years. Cases involving murder charges, especially those with complicating factors like drug use and mental state issues, often take a long time to resolve. For Zoe's family, this meant more years of waiting, more court appearances, more reliving the details of their loved one's death. But they persevered, understanding that the legal process, however slow and difficult, was their path to justice for Zoe. They had waited 5 years for answers about what had happened to her. They could wait a little longer to see her killer face the consequences of his actions. On August 15, 2022, nearly 9 years after Zoe Campos was murdered, Carlos Rodriguez finally faced justice in a Lubbock courtroom. The young man who had been questioned as a witness in 2013 was now standing before a judge and jury as a confessed killer, ready to learn his fate. Carlos chose to plead guilty to murdering Zoe Campos. This plea meant that there would be no lengthy trial where Zoe's family would have to endure hearing all the details of her death repeated in open court. Instead, the focus shifted to the penalty phase, where the jury would determine what sentence Carlos should receive. Even in pleading guilty, Carlos and his legal team continued to emphasize the role that synthetic marijuana had played in the crime. They asked the jury to consider that Carlos's actions had been heavily influenced by K2, hoping this might result in a more lenient sentence. This argument highlighted one of the broader social issues surrounding Zoe's case. Synthetic drugs like K2 were poorly understood and poorly regulated when this crime occurred. They were often sold legally in convenience stores and head shops, marketed as safe alternatives to marijuana. But they were actually far more dangerous, causing unpredictable and sometimes violent reactions in users. Zoe's murder was, in many ways, a tragedy that reflected the dangers of these synthetic substances. A young woman had died because someone she barely knew had consumed a drug that turned him violent and hallucinogenic. It was a senseless death that might have been prevented if the dangers of synthetic marijuana had been better understood and if these substances had been properly regulated. But while the jury may have considered the role of drugs in the crime, they were not swayed by arguments for leniency. After deliberating for just 14 minutes, and remarkably short time for a murder sentencing, they returned with their verdict: life in prison. The brevity of the jury's deliberation sent a clear message. Despite whatever role synthetic drugs may have played in Carlos's actions, he was fully responsible for choosing to consume those drugs and fully responsible for the consequences of his actions. Zoe Campos had been an innocent victim who deserved justice, and the jury was determined to provide it. For Zoe's family, the sentencing represented the end of a nearly decade-long journey toward justice. From that terrible night in November 2013 when Zoe failed to come home, through 5 years of not knowing what had happened to her, through the discovery of her remains and Carlos's confession, through the long legal process that followed, they had endured it all with remarkable strength and determination. The life sentence meant that Carlos Rodriguez would never again be free to harm another young woman. It meant that he would spend the rest of his life paying for the few minutes of violence that had ended Zoe's life and devastated her family. But perhaps most importantly, it meant that Zoe Campos would be remembered not just as a victim, but as a young woman whose life had value, whose death demanded justice, and whose family's love and determination had ultimately prevailed over the forces that had tried to hide the truth about what happened to her. As we conclude this story, it's worth reflecting on the broader lessons of Zoe's case. It reminds us of the dangers that young people face when experimenting with unknown substances. It demonstrates the importance of listening to families who insist that their loved ones wouldn't just disappear. It shows how persistence and dedication from both family members and law enforcement can eventually solve even the most challenging cases. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every true crime story is a real person who was loved, who had dreams and plans and people who cared about them. Zoe Campos was 18 years old when she died. She should have had decades ahead of her to live, to love, to contribute to the world. That opportunity was stolen from her, but her memory lives on, and justice was ultimately served. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Zoe Campos, not just as a victim of a terrible crime, but as a young woman whose life mattered, whose family never gave up on finding the truth, and whose story reminds us all to be careful, to be aware, and to never take our safety for granted. Thank you for listening to tonight's True Crime Stories. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next True Crime Stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.